Hello guys, welcome back to another video, and today we are bringing back the KARDS History series with special guest Bear Gardener. So, Bear, why don't you introduce yourself? Hello guys, this is Jaking from the future. Now, unfortunately, I made a pretty big mistake at the beginning of this recording, or the recording of this video, where I completely forgot to record Bear's audio. So I don't have Bear introducing himself, and I don't have Bear giving his sort of initial thoughts on the cards and the expansions and whatnot, and we had to sort of give a summary of his thoughts on the very first card. Now, I did figure out the mistake relatively early on, so we have all of his thoughts on all of the cards after the first card, but just, we don't have his thing in the introduction, so I've just sort of edited around to just include the parts of me speaking to explain stuff, so you guys can still follow along, and of course Bear has all of this knowledge as well. It's just you won't be able to hear Bear's sort of the initial predictions, but I wanted to also make sure that I'm introducing Bear properly, because he didn't have the chance to introduce himself because of this audio recording. So if you do not know who Bear Gardener is, he is a fellow KARDS content creator. He makes videos on YouTube as well as streams quite more regularly than I do, so you can check out his channel and his Twitch in the description down below, and you absolutely should, especially if you are a new player, because Bear does have a much greater focus on sort of new player content and being an advocate for newer players. Than I do over here on this channel. So if you haven't heard of Bear before, or if you've heard of him but you're not subscribed to him for some reason, you should go over there, subscribe to Bear, follow him on Twitch, do all of that fun stuff. And you're about to hear me speak entirely on my own for a bit. I promise that's Bear spoke a lot too. We just don't have the audio, and you'll be able to hear Bear speak soon enough. So again, apologies for this big error, but we didn't want to like re-record everything, and like it wouldn't really be authentic to have him like pretend to see stuff for the first time again. But anyways, let's get back to the video. So, for those who did not watch the previous video, I'll probably also have the link for that in the description of this. But essentially, what we're doing here today is I'm going to be walking Bear through some of the older tournaments and the older balance patches, the older decks, the older meta from a specific point in KARDS competitive history that Bear was not around for, so Bear has no idea what decks were being played, who were playing these decks, etc. And I was around then, so I'm going to be walking Bear through that in the form of a quiz by giving him different cards and asking him to analyze them and say which one he thinks was played, which one he thinks were not played, if he thinks, you know, one of these cards had to have been nerfed or buffed for it to have seen play, or for it to have not seen play, etc. So we'll be asking all sorts of different questions through different pairs of cards as we make our way through some KARDS history, as is in the name. So in the first episode of this, we did OCC 1. June 2020, the first ever OCC. It had a really weird format. It was right off the back of a balance patch, and the decks were kind of all over the place a little bit. The number of Empire of the Suns has decreased a little bit since last time. But instead of doing one singular tournament this time we are going to be looking at 3 separate tournaments over the course of a 2-month period following this. So this will be OCC 2 in July 2020, OCC 3 in August 2020, and KARDS Open 1 in later August 2020. So, for those who, I'm assuming everybody remembers the OCCs. They were the monthly tournaments where it would be the top-ranked players off of the previous season's ladder would qualify and then play out for cash prize. A lot of you might not remember the KARDS Open because that's been gone for a lot longer. The KARDS Open was a very different format where essentially anybody, regardless of rank, regardless of collection, could sign up and play in a Swiss round qualifier on 2 separate qualifier weekends. And after 6-7 rounds, depending on the number of players, they would take the top 8, and then those people would play in a closed bracket tournament for a cash prize. So the KARDS Open saw a different variety of decks and a different variety of players than the OCCs. So that is going to be an interesting factor here, is we're starting to get players bringing tournament decks from different parts of the KARDS community. So the OCCs at this point are still relatively self-enclosed. You're seeing the same like 4 or 5 people every single tournament, and they have a specific brand. But the Open, we're seeing a lot more new faces in the KARDS Open, and the reason that it's cutting off at the end of August 2020 is because there's a big September 2020 balance patch that completely upended the meta. So there's this brief window where there is 3 tournaments with no balance patches, and the reason we're starting in July is because something else came out in July 2020, and that is the Theater of War expansion. So, Bear, at this moment, feel free to go to your collection and look at what cards came out in Theaters of War, remembering to hit the show both reserved cards and active cards. Theaters of War was a very small expansion, actually quite similar to United Front in terms of size, where there was only a handful of cards for each nation. And it also came with a bunch of PvE content, which you could play to unlock these cards. And also just, it was quite fun. And the cards themselves, there was some theming within the nations, but there was also theming within the elites. And this is something that cards used to do a lot. That was something I really enjoyed, is they'd sort of have like a thematic elite that every nation got a version of. The most simplistic one is the choose one of 3 elite cards. Every nation just got a 2-credit choose one of 3 elites from their nation, or elite units from their nation. And then the other one is, in Theaters of War, each nation got a very expensive order elite. So if you actually scroll to the bottom, you'll see all 5 of them right there. Theaters of War came out in the beginning of July, and then we got the OCC, Theaters of War cards all allowed. There was no balance patch since the previous OCC, and if you remember, I'm not going to ask you if you remember, because it's been a while, but I'll just tell you, in the previous OCC, the top deck was Germany, Japan, mid-range, with a lot of burn components. It had old Axiom that could trigger multiple times a turn, joint operation that could go face, a couple other very annoying cards in there that were quite strong. And elsewhere in the meta, there wasn't really any fixed decks outside of Germany, to be completely honest. Like, people were trying some Soviet control, people were trying some Britain control, people tried some ramp, people tried some air. It was all over the place. Germany, Japan was sort of the main deck. There has not been a balance patch since then, but the Germany-Japan deck was nerfed before that tournament, and people started to see, like, well, maybe there's different things you can do with Germany. So I'll give you that as a head start to start thinking about what cards people are going to be playing and what decks people are going to be playing. I'll quickly show off on my end here the players that we had in the 2 OCCs. The Opens, it was eventually won by Darkness. Darkness was a bit of an open merchant back in the day. He'd qualify to every OCC and lose in the first round of every OCC, but he would win every single Open, which is arguably much harder. So yeah, Darkness, absolute open merchant. And then regulars in the OCC at this point were myself, Canada Bear, Blue Blast, Ari Big Ben, and Darkness. And, you know, we'd sort of like formed teams by this point and we're sharing decks back and forth. But we're going to put that aside and focus not on the players, but on the decks and the cards. So let's roll the intro and jump into our first pair.
What a performance there by J-King.
J-King, full plot armor.
J-King is pushing himself into the ranks of the legend.
J-King is our world champion! J-King 7! What? The back-to-back KARDS world champion!
Alrighty, so our first pair of cards here, we're going to be looking at Germany, because as you know, Germany was the most popular nation in the first OCC. It was brought 9 times out of a possible 8 players. And the format for the OCC has also changed a little bit this time. The very first OCC was there was no limitations on main nations. You just had to you could bring 2 decks of the same main nation. The only restriction was you couldn't play a deck you'd won with, and you had to switch main nations every game. So you could bring 2 Germany decks like Blue Blast did, and you have to play one of them in game 1, and then you have to play your 3rd deck in game 2, and then win or lose, you can bring a German deck in game 3 again. They changed that rule because it was very convoluted, very silly. Going forward, you have to bring 3 decks of 3 different main nations. However, at this point in time, there is still no bans, and there is, I believe that we are still on closed deck lists for at least the next couple OCCs. So, at this point in time, it is still very much a little archaic. The first ever Opens introduced bans and open deck lists to cards. So the Open that we'll get to, well, I mean, these decks are kind of from all of the tournaments, but the Opens did have bans, the OCCs did not, which is a very interesting format change. And once we get into bans, we will see decks kind of change accordingly, when you can just be like, okay, this is the strongest strategy, I'll ban it and then bring other stuff, as opposed to, this is the strongest strategy, I'll lose to it. So, with Germany being the top dog from the previous OCC, the previous video, I thought it would only be fair to start off with 2 German cards, one from the base set and one from Theaters of War, and you will tell me which of these 2 cards do you think people were playing with. And actually, I should quickly mention, since I'd forgotten to mention that up until now, in the last time we did this, the cards were 1 card did not see play, 1 card did see play. Which one was which? This time, your job is to tell me which card saw more play. So, some of these, at least one of these, in all of the cases, saw play. Sometimes the other one will not have seen play, sometimes it saw a little play. There is 2 cases where both saw a lot of play. Like, it's sort of an equal amount of a lot of play, in that I wasn't going to count all of them because they were seen in almost every single deck. So, keep that in mind, but there was no ones where neither played. There was always one played and at least one. And I'll just get you to guess how much you think each one saw play afterwards. But keep that in mind. Alright, so, apologies guys, I forgot to record Bear's audio. That's totally on me. You'll probably have seen a bit of a recorded in post intro explaining all of this. But, anyways, so Bear, do you want to, like, quickly summarize your thoughts on, the KFC? Obviously, you've already guessed, but, you know, just to let people hear your analysis, that you had.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I went and I looked at one specific card because I wanted to remind myself if Blitzkrieg was still around from core, which it was, because I need to keep reminding myself what's available at the time, and obviously we're only dealing with core and theatres at the moment. And then I came to the carefully considered conclusion that out of the 2 of these cards, if they had not both seen a ton of play, the one that presumably would have seen more play would be basically, due to the sheer amount of tanks that Germany has, permanent 3/3 one-op artillery. I then discovered that apparently I'd have been a terrible player back then, because we'd rather just have a rolling buff, which is a good rolling buff, but there you go.
So, Wespe came out in Theaters of War, so a couple of weeks before the first of the OCCs. And people definitely tried it out on ladder. People were curious, because at this point in time, the sort of 3-cost artilleries, there was the Elite Autocanone, there was the Priest, and, like, Priest didn't really see play because you couldn't consistently have the front line in a very aggressive meta. And then there was Wespe, and the German deck, the more tempo-oriented German deck at the time, essentially always had tanks on board if they had any units on board, or any units in hand, they would all be tanks. So Wespe was essentially a permanent 3/3 artillery, like 90% of the time. And people decided that they didn't want to play that, and nobody brought Wespe across all of the German decks across all 3 of these tournaments. There was not a single Wespe as far as I saw. KFC, on the other hand, saw a lot of play. I did not bother counting it. It saw a lot of play in a variety, not a variety of different German decks, but it saw a lot of play in different German decks. And I think the reason behind this is, at the time, people were running Nebelwerfer a lot in German decks. And Nebelwerfer, it is 2/2, so it's smaller in stats, but its deployment deal 1 damage, and that is just critical of doing something the turn it comes out, because the game was so oriented around board control. You know, we didn't have strategic focus on Depths of Winter and whatnot at this time, so early game board control was very, very critical, so just getting out a Nebelwerfer to immediately ping something that you can trade off and clear your opponent's units on board would snowball harder than just playing simply a slightly larger artillery, because if you play a larger artillery that doesn't affect the board state, then your opponent can trade off your tanks and then hit the 1/3 artillery on their turn, you're probably just over. So that's the idea. I think we probably undervalued Wespe. I think there's definitely an argument for it being compared to Nebelwerfer, but that was the idea. Then you ran the KFC, of course, to buff the attack of your Nebelwerfer or your other tanks, or it's just a tank itself. So yeah, that's it is not any fault in your analysis here. It really is just, just because people did something back in the day does not mean that it was correct, as we have covered in the past with the likes of nobody running Lend-Lease, but everybody running Empire of the Sun. Was it good, was it bad? Who can say for sure? We'll never know unless KARDS introduces some, like, historic game mode where we just played with all these cards again, which would be cool. But now let's get to the any possible changes you think happened to these cards. Was Wespe worse on release, and that's why we weren't playing it? Was KFC, super cracked back in the day, and that's why people were playing it? Do you think any of these cards saw any changes?
I've got to believe for my own dignity that one of them must have been a change, and I'm kind of wondering. I can't see any change that you would put on the KFC truck that would be sane, because it's so good as it is. So I'm hoping that Wespe was somewhat less good on release, but that's really just hoping for my own dignity.
That would honestly be a very reasonable take, especially considering that Germany was by far and away the best nation in the game prior to Theaters of War, so giving Germany a card like Wespe was definitely a bit risky in just further enabling, sort of tank-themed German decks. But actually, Wespe was exactly that on release. Wespe has never been changed. The KFC, on the other hand, at the time of this tournament, had 2 health. It was a 1/2.
I'm sorry, what now?
Yes. Still with Blitz,
I mean, I now
adjacent units.
Alright, now I kind of understand why everyone would run it over the Wespe. Because literally the only saving grace when you see the KFC truck hit the board, unless it's after Blitz Doctrine, nowadays, I should say, is that it's really easy to trade out or remove. That extra point of health is huge.
Yes, so KFC was one of the cards that they nerfed in September 2020, so after this 3-tournament period, they looked at the data and were like, well, that's probably not a card that we want to be at a 1/2, so we're going to nerf it to a 1/1. And it kind of fell off the map for a very long time. People thought at 1/1 it was just absolutely unplayable. Just because, it dies to Sickle, it dies to Nebelwerfer, it just dies to all of these 1-damage pings. And now it's... I don't really know if it's making a comeback necessarily. You see it a lot more often because of Blitz Doctrine. But, people still aren't really playing it just hard in their decks to this day. And, at 1/2, maybe KFC would be balanced in 2025 cards, but it certainly was not balanced in 2020 cards.
No, I do have to say, though, I do take umbrage slightly with your analysis. If Blitz Doctrine was rotated in 2025 cards, maybe they'd have 1/2 would be balanced. While Blitz Doctrine is still in the game, no, it wouldn't.
All right.
I'm just saying.
Fair enough. Now we get to the question of, we're going to look at, in the past, I always had you compare 2 cards of the same nations. We're switching it up now. We're doing cards of different nations compared to each other. So for this one, you will be comparing 2 more aggressive sort of buffing cards for US and Japan in the form of Combat Engineers and For the Emperor. So For the Emperor classic card, Combat Engineers card from Allegiance.
Okay. See, there's a part of me that just looking at the 2 cards is like, immediately one of them seems better, but I'm very conscious that the 164th came out. And that's 0 op cost. Which makes the 109... makes the 109 a lot better.
I will also point out that some of these cards could have been nerfed or buffed, between when we were playing with it and now, which obviously makes it a little difficult, because you're like, well, any card could have just been insane or terrible. But just
kind of half the fun, though. Yeah, it's kind of half the fun. I mean, you know, I want to hope that that hasn't had to be nerfed at some point. What else does the US have right now? Nope, for two very good reasons in my head, I've got to believe that For the Emperor would have seen more play. I really do. Just because it's a really cheap buff, and if you're playing aggressively, which Japan kind of still has the pool to do, although it's not utterly cracked, but you know, 15th Cav still exists.
Also,
I
Bicycle
kind of
Regiment.
yeah, he's usually the one that gets me. Is the existence of Bicycle Regiment on its own makes For the Emperor very, very good. And as I mentioned earlier, well, as I didn't apparently mention earlier in the intro, that I'm very aware that Feigned Retreat came out, and that's really good for being aggressive. So yeah, I'm gonna say I think For the Emperor probably saw a fair chunk of play in just ludicrous charging Japan decks.
All right. So I will say that between these two cards, Combat Engineers saw more play than For the Emperor. And I'll throw this one in. How much? So Combat Engineers saw more play. How much play do you think either of these cards saw in this period?
Right, so now you're telling me For the Emperor saw less play,
Yes.
which makes me think that these two cards might have been a bit more experimental than they are in my head. I mean, we are coming back off Germany just dominating everything. Maybe these saw just kind of some play but nothing major? In my head, it's either some play but nothing major, or just US and Japan was everywhere. I don't think there's a middle ground there. I can't imagine that there's a kind of a happy medium people playing with these, because they are both really interesting cards.
So there's it's the two extremes. There was a lot of Combat Engineers going around, and there was not a single For the Emperor played in this tournament, or in these three tournaments, as far as I'm aware. People were definitely playing For the Emperor in general at this period a little bit. It is entirely possible that there was, like, somebody had it in a deck and never drew it, because again, in this period we don't have the published deck list of all of the players, so it's possible that somebody had it and just never drew it, but if they did, it would have been a very small number, whereas Combat Engineers was definitely in a wide variety of decks. Oh, wait, I keep saying wide variety of decks. It was in a lot of decks.
I'm not sensing wide variety from my read of the card pool. I'm sensing it was in more or less one very particular US deck, but I'm sure we'll find out later. That's half the fun of doing this stuff.
Do you think either of these cards were changed from their current version in the game, the one you're looking at?
I really, really have to hope that, like, I'm looking at a buffed version of For the Emperor or something, because it feels like zero, or maybe it was just nobody recognized the importance of, like, zero op cost. I don't know. I kind of want to think Combat Engineers has just stayed the same, though, because I do understand why it's good value. If one of them has been changed and I'm not convinced, I think it'd be For the Emperor, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're both the same as they always have been.
All right. Well, sorry to say, but actually both of these cards have been changed.
Of course they have.
And we'll start with For the Emperor. So, you said that you think For the Emperor. You said that if one of them was changed, it was probably For the Emperor, and it was probably worse than it used to be. For people not to have been playing it. Well,
yeah, I'm going to assume it must have been worse at the time for people not to have played it at all.
Actually, at the time, it was substantially better, and it had to be nerfed down the line. So this is the version of For the Emperor that existed at this point in the game.
What?
Yeah.
And people chose not to play this.
Yes. So it saw a lot of play. It saw a lot of play in general. I think it was played in the first OCC in a Britain-Japan air deck, and it was definitely saw a lot of play later down the line to the point where it had to be nerfed. The funny thing about For the Emperor is nobody ever used it on Japanese units, and that's why when they nerfed it to this version, it just completely fell off the map and everyone stopped playing it, because all of the Japanese units that are worth playing have 0 operation cost already, so it's basically just 1 credit, give your units +1 attack this turn, which isn't particularly good. For just an order that doesn't do anything else. When you're doing it on other units, though, that are not Japanese, it can be very, very strong. And as I mentioned in Air, you play this on Swordfish and Gladiator and whatnot, or you play this in a sort of a tank-based German-Japan deck, was very popular like a couple years later, where you would use this to basically move and attack with a bunch of 1 operation cost tanks in a single turn.
Or perhaps you run Germany main and play this on a near permanent 3/3 artillery that's now 0 op cost?
Yeah, this one we were definitely sleeping on. And actually, sleeping on might not be a fair characterization of people's relationship with this card. People knew this card was good. It's just, was there better things to be doing? Maybe. Maybe not. Let's take a look now at the combat engineers. And so it was changed. Do you think it was nerfed or buffed? The current version, do you think, is a nerfed version of the card or a buffed version of the card?
Please tell me, for the sake of my own honor, that it's the version I was looking at has somehow been, like, nerfed, and it was better back in the day.
That is absolutely correct. Combat Engineers was nerfed quite substantially for a card that is still as good as Combat Engineers is. This was the original Combat Engineers.
So I am taking a moment to read.
Yeah, it is very low res. It's very difficult to find high quality images of some of these cards.
But okay. Yeah, okay. Sure.
So,
I'm going to defend myself in that I was evaluating 2 very different cards.
Yeah, so for our audio-only listeners here, what is the difference between our combat engineers now and back in the day?
Right, so the 2 versions we've got are... What have we got? Oh, blurry vision. When another friendly unit moves into the front line, give it +1/+1. And when another friendly unit moves into the front line, give it +1 attack. I was judging based on just getting +1 attack, and granted it has 1 point less defense back in the day. The unit itself, instead of being a 1/2, was a 1/1 that gave +1/+1 to a friendly unit moving into the front line. But I have got to point out how utterly insane that is on a unit that has smokescreen, when the pool was not as removal heavy as it is nowadays.
So now you're beginning to understand the choice of Nebelwerfer as a 3-of in every German deck over Wespe, because if you couldn't kill your opponent's combat engineers, the game's kind of over.
I mean, a little bit, yeah. I mean, you look at this and you consider a number of US units, even just US units, but you don't really just want to consider US units, because this hits friendly units, and dear sweet lord, I don't want to think about the things you could do with this.
So in 2021, 2022, there was a lot of, several years down the line, sort of like the big tempo decks of the time were US German Frontline and Air, and a lot of that came down to, could US Frontline play Combat Engineers in its current version with +1 attack into 35T to make a 3/2 0-op blitz tank that could hit a 3 health unit in the support line from Air before they could buff it. Back in the day, we were dealing with Combat Engineers 35T to make a 3/3 0-op tank that's going to hit face for 3. And yeah, you now have to deal with that. You have to deal with the smokescreen Combat Engineers. You have to deal with whatever they're playing down on 3 credits. Yeah, it was a bit of a nightmare. And this card came out in Allegiance. So this card came out in December 2019. So that's about 8 to 9 months before these tournaments are being played. it still hadn't been nerfed, and it was only just starting to see a lot of play, because people were so obsessed with, particularly the 34th Infantry, the 1-cost 2-3 op infantry that we looked at in the previous one, that people weren't really looking at combat engineers, but people started to look at combat engineers, and combat engineers also got nerfed in the September 2020 balance patch, which came out immediately following these 3 tournaments. For the Emperor was not nerfed until September 2021, so a full year later, and I'm sure one day we will cover the decks that got that card nerfed later down the line. And
yeah, but the decks that got this card nerfed are not like the decks that got this card nerfed. They're just decks that had this card in it.
yeah, that's kind of fair. The card is just an absolutely bonkers card. So we've looked at Germany, what sort of German tempo tank decks were doing. We've looked at what were the sort of the US, Japan, very aggressive decks are doing. Now let's take a look at 2 Japanese elites and see what Japan was up to in this period. So these are 2 cards that I'm sure you are familiar with. But here you go. Feigned Retreat, To the Last Man. Which one saw more play across these 3 tournaments?
I'm attempting not to snap decision. I am literally, if the viewer is interested, / the listener is interested, what is going through my head now is an attempt to make an argument, any sane argument I can come up with, why To the Last Man would see more play than Feigned Retreat. Like, they're both good cards, but for anyone who doesn't know, like, Feigned Retreat is ludicrous. Played on curve and at the right time, Feigned Retreat is one of the most insane cards I've ever read. It is hypothetically possible that they both saw play, because To the Last Man is a good back end, but I cannot see it because Feigned Retreat is going to make the game over so much faster. I really want to believe that just, unless there's been changes to the card, I have to believe Feigned Retreat must have seen play because it's so good.
So again, the question is which saw more play. Both of them could have seen play, or they both could have seen an equal amount of play. It could be one of those. People could be running To the Last Man and Feigned Retreat in the same Japan deck.
I'm not buying that. I might buy that there is a Japan control deck that likes To the Last Man. Kind of, maybe, but am I missing something from the tools that Japan had right now? Is there anything that is making me think that you would be mad enough to try that? I mean,
they had Empire of the Sun, recently nerfed to 10 credits.
Yeah, no, I'm sold. I mean, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's just it right there. Don't even get me started on that madness. It's fine. I understand people do things. I mean, there are a couple of things that are in. You know what? I'm going to take a punt on this one because I feel like taking a punt and say I think they both saw play and quite possibly an even amount of play. I just don't necessarily think in the same deck.
All right. Well, honestly, I'm not sure if you get one for this one or not. This one was kind of the weird one. This one's kind of on me. To the Last Man saw more play, but they are very close. To each other. There was one more To the Last Man than there was Feigned Retreat. And you are correct that they are in different decks, although I have seen my fair share of Feigned Retreat To the Last Man on ladder. In tournaments, people weren't that crazy or inspired. Now, the question is, how much play do you think that these cards saw?
You're playing into seeing huge amounts of US, but you're playing 2 decks. I'm going to go with some, but not earth-shattering amounts. Because I can't imagine that I mean, I know we're over 3 tournaments, but we are talking about 2 separate decks here. So I can't imagine it's like overwhelmingly large amounts, but I suspect it's decent. Like, it's a moderate amount of play.
So there's actually a very small amount of play for both of these cards. And interestingly enough, they were from their own, each in their own tournament. And this is starting to show sort of the effects of deck building communities and teams are having on these OCCs. So in the OCC2, there was a fair amount of just very aggressive Japan decks. Some had Feigned Retreat, some didn't have Feigned Retreat. Feigned Retreat had just come out, and people weren't sold on if this card is just better than running a lot of orders. Because, you know, if you do want expansions and Feigned Retreats in the same deck, stuff like that, you know, you can't run air blitzes. People were really in on the burn strategy at this time, and Feigned Retreat didn't quite work with that. And then, oddly enough, the Feigned Retreat just was in that OCC2. No Feigned Retreat in OCC3 or the Open. And then in OCC3, there was a Japan control deck with To the Last Man in it that was all brought by like a series of teammates, and was not brought in OCC2, and it didn't get brought in the Open. So just sort of weird pocket metas, people trying out different decks, trying to find the best third deck, the best second deck in the lineup, you know, trying to find the ways to counter some of the more popular stuff going on in the meta. But neither of them saw an overwhelming amount of play. Now the question is, do you think either of these cards have ever been changed?
I have to believe I'd know about it if they have. These cards are talked about enough that surely I'd know about it if they have, and I don't recall anyone ever telling me about Feigned Retreat or To the Last Man being changed. I'm pretty sure these are still the same card.
You don't believe that Feigned Retreat used to be 4 credits?
I'm sorry, what?
No, I'm kidding.
Don't do that to me!
Yeah, they're...
I mean, I love you, man, but really? You're gonna give me a cardiac episode?
Yeah, there was one very slight change to Feigned Retreat, and it was just a wording change to add the Give Your HQ effect,
yeah.
but that was fairly recent, and it's not an actual change. These cards have remained exactly the same in functionality since they were released in a Feigned Retreat in Theaters of War and To the Last Man in Allegiance, respectively. And honestly, I think that's fine. I think To the Last Man could maybe be buffed to 9 credits at some point, just compared to some of the other AoE in the game. Feigned Retreat at 6 credits, I think, is a very healthy point. That was honestly just a shockingly well-balanced card, considering how many other cards released at around the same time have gone through so many iterations of changes.
Yeah, I mean, it sits where it sits. Like, I don't, like, Feigned Retreat is a very, very good card. I personally think played in the right deck, it's utterly cracked. But, it's at its value, which is why I was quite possibly going to faint when you play the 4 credit trick on me. But no, if we ever sit down and talk about current kind of metas and trying to bring old, less used cards back up, I kind of agree with you. I do think To the Last Man, in the modern sense of cards, could probably be buffed a bit. It feels a bit heavy right now, but yeah, okay, I'm happy with that. I'm giving myself enough of an understanding that I do get it, and I sort of get that there's a lot of experimentation going, and I'm starting to get the feeling that there are a couple of very, very dominant decks.
Yeah, you did a very good job on this one. And I will say, part of the reason that I'm in the first video I did was which of these 2 cards that have a similar effect saw play, and one did and one didn't at all. At this point, one, we're just dealing with more tournaments, so more decks overall, and 2, there is definitely more experimentation in terms of just cards in decks over the next 3 tournaments than there was in the first tournament. So it's very difficult to find a card which isn't just like abjectly terrible that didn't see at least like 1 of or 2 of in most decks, or in some decks at some point over the course of these 3 months, because also the card pool is also quite small. So, you know, people have tried out a lot of different stuff, so you have to find, you know, what people found that was very good or dominant and whatnot, or cards that saw pretty substantial changes. Now we are back, sticking to the bit more of the tempo side of it. Let's now take a look at another pair of US and Japan cards, but one that aren't necessarily fitting into the same decks as, say, the other ones that we looked at. Which of these 2 cards do you think saw more play?
Oh, Oh, I've played both of these cards a lot. Okay, I'm being guided by my instincts about what we've learned through the last few kind of cycles, and as much as I actually rate both of these cards, and I think one of them is in what may or may not just be its current form better. I think the Alliance probably saw more play, and possibly be quite a bit, given what we've kind of seen coming in US, but not in US decks. But I have a feeling Alliance might have seen some play in some tokens-based decks, which I pointed out, or tried to point out earlier in the unrecorded audio I did mention when Shaking asked me about whether there was anything that popped out from the expansion, and support for reserves was in there. And I've got to think that a US ally, US ally for a Soviet deck would make that a very attractive kind of extra buff. So that's my guess. My guess is the Alliance saw more play, and I'm not sure Naval Supply Run, given what we've established about other buff cards in Japan, really saw much play at all.
All right. Well, you have nailed this one absolutely on the head. The Alliance saw more play than Naval Supply Run. And how much play do you think that these two cards saw in this tournament? So the Alliance definitely saw more.
I would not be surprised if Naval Supply Run saw nearly zero play. I would also think the Alliance, I think, probably saw in the way that, in my head, the game had to feel about board control at the time. I have to believe that there's a good chance that Soviet infantry spam was not a bad deck to play. So I think the Alliance probably saw a decent chunk of play.
All right, well, that is actually absolutely correct. There was no Naval Supply Run, as far as I saw, throughout this entire tournament, and there was a lot of the Alliance. Now, do you think either of these cards have been changed?
I'm fairly certain that someone mentioned to me in the past that Naval Supply Run's been changed. I've never heard of the Alliance being changed, so I'm going to go with probably not, because it was being played when I first came to the game and I did use it, so I think that's the case, but I'm also only about 50% on this.
So, now you have me questioning myself, if the Naval Supply Run has ever been changed. I didn't think so, but I didn't look too far into it because I didn't think so. So maybe I'll have to fact check myself there. But the Alliance did see a change. The Alliance did used to be 4 credits.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, that's gonna see a ton of play because that's good value at 5.
Yeah, so the Alliance, you know, it saw a little bit of play in OCC1. There was 2 or 3 token decks, and I think they all had 2 copies of the Alliance in it. Well, one of them was actually a bit more aggressive, so that one might not have had it. But there was definitely some Alliance in some token decks in OCC1. In the later tournaments, OCC2, OCC3, Open 1, the Alliance definitely became a very, very dominant card here. And it had to be nerfed in September 2020. We'll see that a lot of these cards that we're looking at so far have all been nerfed in the same balance patch after these 3 tournaments, which is why there's such a distinct separation between the meta before and after this balance patch. They absolutely went to town on nerfs on a lot of these cards in a way that they really don't do so that much anymore. Nowadays, balance patches are really like, 3 or 4 nerfs and a bunch of buffs. Back in the day, they just took the chainsaw to some of these decks, and left.
I mean, to be fair, so a number of these people are friends and acquaintances of mine. So, shout out to the design team for the fact that they have definitely gotten a lot less insane/high over the years. Because there are cards that in the early part of this game, with the best will in the world, and I love 1939, but you can see the small development team trying to find its footing in some of these cards, and a 4-cost the Alliance is definitely one of them.
So, now we've looked at sort of the more tempo side of things, now let's take a look at more of the control side of things, and also take a look at some of the theaters of war cards. So, let's take a look at, as I mentioned, the elites, where each nation got like a big fancy elite from theaters of war. Which of these two big fancy elites do you think saw more play in these tournaments?
I'm going through the same process again. I'm trying to make an argument to myself that my snap judgment could possibly be wrong. Sometimes that's the best way to approach any form of analysis. I'm looking at this and going, there is a standout card here that I personally think is utterly cracked, and I'm making sure that I'm not missing. There are cards here that just would presumably make it insane. The other one, I'm concerned about personal bias, but I'm just going to be honest. I think Rule Britannia probably saw more play, because I think Rule Britannia is just a better card, because Exploit the Gap bases on RNG, and I know we're talking about a relatively unit-heavy meta, but I'm not loving the if followed by draw 1 of 3 and bury 2 versus I'd just like to give all of my aircraft +2 defense and then match their attack to their defense in a nation that has a bunch of 1/3 aircraft. So yeah, I'm going to trust my instincts and say I think Rule Britannia probably saw more play.
Can I bait you into changing your mind if I bring up that in the previous tournament, right before Theaters of War, the most played deck was almost always had control of the front line and ran Leopold, Panther G's, Tiger 1E, similar, like Comet, Takasagi, some pretty hefty units, and use stuff like Joint Operation to control the early game, and now Root Out is another card that they have access to. Is that going to change your mind at all?
You're doing a good job. You are giving me food, but still, really at 6 credits? Because the previous deck that you're talking about is very, very good. But are you really at 6?
I mean, they were running Bismarck. That's 10 credits. Do nothing. Unless it wins you the game.
I mean, yeah, I know. But no, I'm trusting my own analytical brain and believing that there is someone out there who realizes that just pure one good turn of reach. Like there are problems with it, but I've still got to believe. I want to hope. I'm so going to be wrong, but go for it.
No, you are absolutely correct. Rule Britannia saw more play. How much play do you think that these cards saw? Do you think anyone's brought Exploit the Gap? Was Rule Britannia a popular card?
I can't see Rule Britannia being... I can see it seeing some play, maybe just because there are going to be people out there who are thinking that there are some matchups that Britain can just about get a good edge on. It's a good finisher. Given everything else that we're seeing come out with, like the value on things like the Alliance and stuff, I can't see it being a dominant card, and honestly, I don't believe anyone's bringing Exploit the Gap at this point.
All right. Well, you're spot on the money with Exploit the Gap. Nobody brought Exploit the Gap. I think it's been brought one time in OCC. I have a vague memory of somebody bringing it at some point and losing. It's not a good card. Rule Britannia, though, I think I have to double check here, but I'm pretty confident that Rule Britannia was in every single British deck except one across these 3 tournaments. Maybe except for 2.
Actually makes me really happy, because it suggests that people had gotten better at evaluating cards.
Yes, Rule Britannia...
Because it's really good.
...was a very popular choice in these tournaments. People were very much enjoying playing around with Britain having a win condition that's not Commonwealth. Now, do you think either of these cards have been changed based on this information?
I would not be shocked, given, and just on the way that things have been, I would not be shocked if Rule Britannia either gave a higher defense buff, which I hope would not be true, or was slightly cheaper. Exploit the gap. I mean, I've got to be honest, this is a card that I'm not great at evaluating because I look at it, I read it, and then I put it in the bicycle spokes part of my card brain and stop thinking about it. It could have been anything, really. But since it didn't see play, it might well have been as it was. I'm going to assume it was as it was because I can't think of I can't think of a change that you'd make to it that wouldn't be like, oh, it was like 3 credits cheaper and everybody wanted to play it because it seemed like a cheap way to roll for a win. But Rule Britannia, I would not be at all shocked if it was like maybe 7 credits or had a slight change that made it slightly better than it currently is. Because, I mean, it's still a good card at 8, but I have a feeling it might have been a touch better.
So honestly, that's a very good valuation. That's a very, very good guess. Unfortunately, Rule Britannia has always been 8 credits, give your units +2 defense, and then set attack equal to defense. And honestly, there's been some suggestions to make it 7 credits, now that it has definitely fallen off the map from its previous heights in 2020. Exploit the Gap, on the other hand, used to be 7 credits on release.
Sorry, I was just opening it because I was kind of hoping you were about to finish off with, but there was a text. No.
No. No,
It's just rank. It's terrible. It's an awful, awful card.
Yep. This came out in the same expansion as Fade Retreat.
Yeah, I know. It's what's breaking my brain. Like, it came out in expansion where they went, let's give really cool elites to everybody. And then, to be fair, I do get that Germany had been dominant before, but that's a serious fish to the face for Germany. That's such a bad card.
Yeah. They could have, like, given Germany a card that, like, you could really only play in a deck that plays Germany in a very different way to the way it's been played. Like, I don't know, they could have given them, like a big tank or something. Like, I don't know, like a King Tiger-esque unit, or, like, maybe more like a discard synergy card. They got an absolute hot garbage that they buffed this card in January 2021. People still didn't play it at 6 credits. You'd, like, see it from time to time, but the issue with this card has always been you need cheap units to get the front line early to play this card, and if you have cheap units in your deck, Exploit the Gap has a high chance of doing absolutely nothing.
Yeah, Exploit the Gap has a really high chance of you going, here, have my credits. I didn't need them anyway.
Yeah, it's very difficult to imagine, like, at 5, I think people wouldn't play this. At 4, I think you'd probably start to see people, like, try to play this for just, like, high roll potential, and it still wouldn't be a good
I was going
to
say, at 4, I can believe that a number of the very, very good combo cookers that I happen to know might give it a go. Yeah. But even then, I still think it's awful. But I'm not going to lie, I think you could put it at 2 credits and no one would play it.
Yeah, Exploit the Gap, unfortunately, is, you know, left to rot in the dustbin of KARDS history. I don't think... maybe it's going to get, like, fully reworked one day, because it's really cool card art. It's a cool card
I was going to say, it's a shame, if nothing else, because of the history of the phrase and the really cool art, that it is such a garbage card.
So, yeah, that was the case of Rule Britannia versus Exploit the Gap. Now let's take a look at 2 Soviet cards. For first time, we're taking a look at Soviets here, and we're looking at 2 cards of theirs that both came out in theaters of war. So we are going to be looking at Ura and Tractor Factories.
Every time Ura comes out, I just, anytime I see the card, I just have to enjoy the art. That's just a me thing. They're both so good. Does the fact that we're in a value world change anything? I think it actually does. I'm gonna say that I think there is a difference in play between these, but I'm not convinced. Half of me wants to say I actually think it is very possible that Ura saw a lot of play and Tractor Factory saw nearly none. Mainly because I think people would be thinking and leaning in a very specific way with the cards that are in the pool at the moment. Which is a shame, because Tractor Factories is a very good card. So I'm going to trust my instincts, and that's what I'm going to go with.
I will also remind you that there is still two pairs where the cards saw a lot of play in both, or both cards saw a lot of play.
Do you happen to know how many pairs we've got left?
We are slightly less than halfway through.
I'm fact-checking myself on the Soviet card pool in case I've missed something. Because you like baiting me, really.
And you can play these cards together if you have 15 credits.
There are a lot of things you can do if you have 15 credits. It doesn't make them good.
If your opponent has 2 1-health units on the board and you have 15 credits, you can hit them for 14.
Yes, you can. I have to say, by that point, I want to believe there's something more efficient that you can. No. See, now there's the thing. Is that because that card's definitely. I'm gonna regret letting you bait me, but actually, looking at the upper end of Soviet cards here, I actually wouldn't be at all surprised. Go on. I'm gonna hope you're just being nice as opposed to being baity. But all right, it is very possible both of these saw play because they are both good cards. But I am still saying that I think the people are gonna have a whole thing about Ura right now.
So, I hate to break it to you, but Tractor Factories saw more play than Ura in these 3 tournaments. How much play do you think either of these cards saw?
Tractor Factories. Please tell me it's not much. Please tell me Tractor Factories was just in a like a Soviet weight deck that was kind of making weight in board presence. Because I'm sad now for Ura.
Yep. So, Tractor Factories was only played in a handful of decks, and Ura saw absolutely no play across this entire tournament. And now is. As you might expect with Ura seeing no play, I'll just tell you this now. It's not really going to be relevant for any of the other cards. There was 0 tokens being played across all 3 of these tournaments. So yeah, it was very interesting to me that you lasered in on tokens for the Alliance scene play, and the Alliance was definitely played in tokens when people played tokens, but tokens is not the reason that Alliance saw a lot of play in this series of tournaments. So now the question is, do you think either of these cards have been changed? So these are like the 2 big flashy cards that Soviets got from the Theaters of War expansion, and they're seeing very little play in the tournaments following its release.
I've got to hope these both got changed. I've got to hope that the original version of these both was just. I mean, maybe not, but I've got to hope they've seen some change.
So, you are absolutely correct. Both of these cards have been changed. Tractor Factories, we'll start with Tractor Factories. Tractor Factories was 9 credits, which means you can't attack with both of them or move an attack with one of them without additional credit gain. Yeah, Tractor Factories was just very disappointing to play.
I mean, yeah, it's just the maths. How do you miss the maths? But yeah, okay.
I think the worry was that, like, if Tractor Factories cost 8 and, like, people are playing it on turn 8 to just create 2 big tanks, it would be scary. So if you put it at 9, it delays the first turn you can play it on. But, like, the game is not really about just summoning tanks.
Cheating out a pair of T-34s, maybe 2 credits early, arguably 1.
Yeah, it's the discrepancy between the power level of some of these elites is quite bonkers, considering Fade Retreat, again, never been changed, came out, and that was the Japanese version of Tractor Factories of Exploit the Gap. Yeah.
It's so sad.
People did play it a little bit, but that was just like, you were trying to make a very heavy Soviet control deck, and you're like, well, let's just throw in Tractor Factories, it's 2 bodies. Some people did run it with, like, US Ally for a bit of ramp. Some people played. There was a very small amount of credit slot gain in Soviets back in the day, that has since been reworked out when we focus more on class identity. So there was ways to get up to 13 credits in Soviets, even without US, and people were definitely looking at that. But without 13 credits, this card is so bad.
Just sits there, crying quietly in a corner.
And Ura is a very interesting one, where Ura was changed, and for all intents and purposes, it was a buff. Like, its rate of play since its change is shot up through the roof, and it became an excellent card, honestly one of the best cards that Soviets has ever received, arguably. It is such a powerful card, and it absolutely was because of this change. However, at the time of the change, it was intended to be a nerf.
God, I have to see the original. What? No, okay, no. I can see why you would think.
So, Ura is the only card in KARDS history to have ever been emergency nerfed. And I know we had the, like, quote-unquote emergency nerf of Reichsbank and Commando Raid before Worlds, where it was like, Worlds is in a couple weeks, and we're just gonna, like, change these 3 cards just for the sake of, like, making Worlds be more interesting and using more new cards. There was a balance patch that changed a couple cards, and then within 24 hours, they had to release a new immediate balance change that exclusively changed Ura from its old version to its current version. To just delete a very specific deck from the game.
I can see that there would be some very good reasons for that. That is a ludicrously strong global effect.
And what deck that was does not fall into the purview of this particular video, so we're going to leave that one for the future. I think it is in the next one, though, because Ura was changed in October 2020. So there was a patch October 1st, 2020. Ura was changed October 6th, 2020. People figured out the deck on October 5th, 2020. So... next time we do this, you will finally learn what it was that needed Ura to be changed. And after it was changed, people went from never playing this card to until they discovered one specific deck. It got changed to its current version, and then it went a fairly long time without people really playing it, because like tokens just had other ways of buffing attack, and there was kind of like critical mass at that point of like which buff attack you want to run in close combat's just cheaper. And it really wasn't until self-damage came around that people started having, like, these huge 6/6 infantries that are, like, slow and stuck in the support line. And it's like, well, actually, like, if you just, like, slam Ura, then hit with, like, a 6/6 infantry and a 5-attack tank into, like, a couple of 2-health units in the front line, you're burning a lot of damage.
I was going to say, you suddenly have quite a lot of carryover. I can see that.
Yeah, so, Soviets really didn't get a whole lot out of Theaters of War at the time. Heroes of the Soviet Union, the choose one of 3 elites, at this point in time, it was the second best out of the choose one of 3. Out of the 5, historically speaking, only 2 have seen real play. And Heroes of the Soviet Union was the second one as Soviet control became more popular in the coming months. But elsewise, they didn't really get a lot. Tokens wasn't really seen play, and in the token decks that did see play, they weren't running conscripts. They absolutely were running motors. Motors was an excellent card for tokens. But conscripts was just a little bit too slow, because you didn't quite have the hand refill at the time. Stuff like 5-year plan didn't exist, so like, filling your hand with reserves meant that you weren't, or filling your deck with reserves meant that you weren't hitting, like, your finishers, or your like, big buff cards. Also, there was a couple changes that went to buff tokens at some point, and tokens did eventually see play in tournaments, so we will look at tokens one day. But now, let's move on to... We've looked at some of the control cards, we've looked at some of the Theaters of War cards, we've looked at some of the tempo cards. Let's take a look at 2 cards from the classic set, and you tell me, which of these cards saw more play?
Sorry, I'm so not used to seeing one of these cards actually in front of me unless it's been printed by something else. And the other one, I mean, people try it in Throp nowadays. Need to search a keyword, or at least a word. All right, so this is actually really, really hard, because I have 2 answers to this, and I'm trying. One of them is much more of a gamble, so I'm detaching it and believing that it can't be.
All right.
Because the gamble answer in my head is that they saw an equal amount of play and it was nothing. I kind of have a feeling that it is that Pershing saw play. But I can't believe that anyone was playing the IS-2 that I'm looking at. I mean, I know it could have been changed, but I don't know whether it could have been changed enough, because there's just not enough stuff that I'm seeing that looks like you'd be sending it back to hand often enough. Because you can't. There's no like obvious. I can just. I mean, you could do something ludicrous with naval bombardment, I suppose, but no, I'm going to stick with it. I think Pershing saw more play.
So, I hate to break it to you, but Stalin saw more play in these 3 tournaments than Pershing did. Now, how much play do you think these cards saw?
We're into the I feel like I'm Doctor Strange right now. All right. So, still out there, but I can see why you wouldn't if you've got other things you can be doing. Let's go with Pershing didn't see any play at all, and Stalin saw a little bit in some niche, ludicrous Soviet deck.
So, Pershing saw a very small amount of play. I only saw it in 3 decks. 2 of them were the exact same deck brought by the exact same player in 2 separate OCCs, and the third one was a deck which appears to be a copy of that player's deck from someone else in the 3rd OCC. So it's essentially just the same deck brought in, and that deck was brought 3 times. Stalin was brought in every single Soviet deck across all 3 of these tournaments.
Why?
Now,
it's all right. I know we get to move on to the next bit, but why?
Well, this might help explain things. Do you think either of these cards saw any changes?
Yes. I've got Stalin had to be better. I mean, personally, I think they both had to be better to see. But I mean, Pershing, I can sort of see. Because there is enough ramp and the effect is potent enough that you could want to do it, and heavy armor is not nothing. Stalin had to be better, surely.
So, we'll start with Pershing. Pershing has never received any changes to its card decks as far as I am aware. There has been a slight change to its functionality. It used to prevent you from dying from fatigue while it was in the front line. That was changed at some point. So it didn't actually change anything on the card text, though, so I'm not going to send you any images for that, and that was not like a relevant change. Blocking fatigue with Pershing was not something that came up in 99.99% of games. Now, Stalin is an interesting question. Because I had it originally marked down as it had never been changed, but as we were talking here, I did remember, actually, it was changed slightly before I started playing the game, and way before any of these tournaments. This was Stalin back in, pre-April 2019.
Right. I mean, I see why that got changed.
Yeah, back in the day, they were much more liberal with just having cards which were just objectively terrible versions of cards in other nations. They were much more fine with just having cards which were just strictly worse than cards in other decks. Because Germany has like the special 8-cost 8/8 heavy armor 2 tank that can't be pinned. They were
familiar.
Yeah, they were much more fine with the cards like that existing. Back in the day, FW, maybe we'll come to this at some point in the future, but FW, the 5/5 draw card fighter, used to just be a 6/5 vanilla fighter, and Britain had a 6/6 vanilla fighter, and they're the same rarity. Yeah, a lot of those cards were changed over the year.
I can see the argument as to why, like, authenticity-wise, the Joseph Stalin could just be this big fat 8/8 thing that was ludicrously expensive and you rarely see. But from a balance point of view, that card's just objectively awful.
Yeah, so they in April 2019, a month before I started playing this game, they did add the text to the bottom of this card, and that is the same text that exists on that card now. This card has never been changed since then. People were just playing this card. And I think there is 2 reasons why. people were playing this card in Soviet control.
Is one of them some form of global mental pandemic that I'm unaware of?
Perhaps. Perhaps. This is, the September 2020 patch is the patch that made Night Witches, it put Night Witches into its best possible form. So this is still before, like, Soviet control can really dedicate into the fatigue aspect of its game plan. They need to be able to win on board somehow, because they do have really terrible card draw, and not amazing, like, tempo. So they do need a way to win. And I think that Stalin is so popular where Tractor Factories isn't for a couple of reasons. One is that Leopold was sort of like the big control killer in this day. So just like, if you're a control deck, so much of it is built around slowly building up a board and a board and a board, and then if Leopold comes down on turn 10, it's just absolutely game over. And after this point, when people started taking Stalins out of Soviet control because they realized, okay, it's good into Leopold, it's terrible into everything else, Leopold continued to be, like, the big Soviet control killer, like, into 2021, 2022, where just Leopold comes down, and if you're Soviet control, it's so difficult to come back from that point, because all of your cards cost so much to play, and you also have to answer Leopold, which is not easy. So I think part of that's Leopold. That's really the only way people were retweeting it. And the other thing is probably going to make you laugh. Unironically, I think part of it had to do with Empire of the Sun, is this card was big enough that you couldn't really Empire of the Sun it without milling a whole lot of your cards and eventually dying in fatigue. With Empire of the Sun being like the big removal tool in a lot of control mirrors, size did matter. You didn't want to play like a 6 or a 5 attack guy because that gave them a really good hand refill. If you play an 8 attack guy, then now they actually have, it's a detriment to play Empire of the Sun.
But I cannot conceive. I know how smart you people are. Many of you are good friends of. How does that even begin to stack up in your? This is good because it might make an objectively awful, overpriced card cause my opponent to overdraw.
And I will say, there was not a lot of Empire of the Sun going around at this point. It was very popular in OCC1 and saw a drastic decrease in popularity going into these tournaments.
Yet still, that is one of the worst arguments I have ever heard in my life. In the niche situation, which a card we used to think was good but now have realised probably isn't, might see some play, this card, which is ludicrously expensive and maybe if we can play it twice might just be able to survive long enough to win the game, would cause a completely different deck to mill itself a bit.
Yep, that's... There is a little bit more that I think might help explain this a little bit as we get a more full picture of the meta as a whole.
I'm not going to lie, I hope so.
So all I'll say is just keep that in the back of your mind as we look forward and eventually start talking about what people actually brought sort of more holistically, and lineups. Now let's go back to US. So there was a little bit of Pershing. But what else was US playing, and particularly, what card draw was US using?
What? So I legitimately, this has not happened to me before. I don't think I've ever read this card.
Well, that might be true for a lot of the audience, so why don't you walk us through?
I'm looking at special delivery. Like, we have the M4 Sherman. If you're not familiar with that, you probably don't play cards. Which is the nice 4/4 tank that draws you a card if you control the front line on deployment. And then we've got special delivery, which is a 2-cost card that says discard all cards with cost 2 or less from hand, then draw 2 cards. I'm assuming many of you will also never have read this card, and will therefore understand why I'm currently having a little bit of a scroll, looking at the US card pool and thinking, is there some alternate universe in which this is somehow good? No, because I'm like almost 3 screen scrolls down, and I still haven't hit 3 cost cards. That card is objectively awful. I'm so gonna end up looking like an idiot for this, but I cannot in good conscience believe that Special Delivery was seeing play as draw. I have to believe, one, Sherman was seeing play, because the US has still got some really good tools for it, and value is value in the game right now. And two, Special Delivery just cannot have seen play. Please God tell me that thing, it can't, surely.
So, Special Delivery saw more play than Sherman.
In what?
Now,
Carry on, it's fine.
which of these cards, or how much play did these cards see? Special Delivery saw more play.
Well, I mean, given the feels I'm getting from the US, I've got to assume that actually it probably saw a fair amount, but that's because of what I'm going to answer to what I'm going to answer with confidence to the next part of this question, because it has to be true. So, all right, I assuming it saw play and more than Sherman, let's be fair. Let's assume Let's assume that it saw a decent amount of play, and just because I like living in an alternate universe, maybe no one played Sherman because we thought a 4/4 body that gives us card draw is terrible.
So, not quite. There was one player who brought Sherman across all 3 of these tournaments.
Whoever you are, if you are out there and you see this, I love you for being a sane human.
Yeah, there was one player who brought L640 Hyper Aggro, and threw some Shermans in there. I don't think he lost like 0-2 in the first round, and I think he drew Shermans after losing the front line. So it didn't work out well for him. But there was one player who brought Sherman. Special Delivery was incredibly popular. In a variety of decks, and for once I am not wrong in saying variety of decks. The big thing about Sherman not seeing a lot of play was honestly, it wasn't that even that people thought it was bad. It was more just the types of decks that people were playing. Now, the big question, have either of these cards, or both of these cards, seen any changes from the versions that you are looking at now?
In the case of Sherman, maybe, I don't know, it used to be a point more expensive or something that made it slightly less good, but given that people have variants, I can believe that maybe in its current form, but it's never seen change, people just didn't see the value in it, kind of fine. My own just self-worth kind of hangs on the fact that surely Special Delivery did not see play in a variety of decks in that form.
Alright, so let's start with Sherman. Sherman did, in fact, used to be different, but not at the time of this tournament. It was changed before this, but after I started playing the game. This is more of just like an interesting history tidbit. It's not really relevant. Sherman has existed in its current form since before OCCs started. But back in February 2020 was when they made that change to Sherman.
Yeah, I may be misreading. Have you accidentally sent the same card twice?
Oh, I did send you the wrong version of Sherman. I sent you the old version of Sherman first.
Okay!
Whoops. This
Deployment
is
if you
the
control the front.
proper version of Sherman. The one we have now.
There we go! Yeah, it's I did wonder. Yeah, because it's 2 cards now, which is it's a substantial buff. I did wonder, but okay. I just didn't notice it because I didn't. I'm not gonna lie, viewers. If you're wondering what on earth is going on in my head, I honestly didn't even bother to read Sherman, because I am that used to it, and it is that generic a card that I kind of just assumed it hadn't changed, and that's why we've had this little bit of confusion. But okay, so the old version gets you 1 less card, which is frankly actually kind of a big hit.
Yeah, at the cost of it doesn't have to be a US unit, but they wanted to buff Sherman, and they also wanted to nail down class identity a bit more.
Yeah.
Also, There was a moment right before this patch where they changed the operation cost on a whole lot of tanks, and set a whole lot of tanks operation cost to 2 that were previously 1. So I think Sherman used to have 1 operation cost, like back in the early beta. But anyways, that's not really relevant to all of us now because the current version of Sherman, it has existed for a very long time. And people just weren't really playing them because they weren't really putting US units into the front line that much. Which might be weird considering how much play Combat Engineers has seen. Now, Special Delivery, on the other hand, Special Delivery has seen a change. It was nerfed. This was the version of Special Delivery on release in Theaters of War.
Now, in all seriousness, if you look at the pool and you go in a different direction, that break. So, for the purposes of the viewers, it may seem weird that I'm gonna suddenly actually think this somehow makes it better. So you might actually be looking at this and thinking that my own argument kind of goes against me with this. But at the break point of 3, you're now talking about breaking between 2 very different kinds of decks. You're substantially more likely to see a deck that is running like almost everything above 3 cost than you are purely to see everything above 2 cost in my head. I can see why it would, in a more weighty deck, which presumably must have been the case, I can see why it would be. And obviously, drawing 3 cards is kind of the thing. 3 costs, draw 3 cards if you can build around it is really quite good. Because again, and I know J King and I have said this on videos multiple times because we both come from the same school, there is a certain extent to which the card that you discard is a card you might not have seen anyway, because you don't always draw your whole deck. I can see why this would be considered a lot better.
So, Special Delivery is a very difficult card to kind of rate because a lot of decks only actually played 1 copy of it. Because if you only run 1 copy of it, it's just 3 credits, draw 3 cards. The issue with Special Delivery is it is a standard, so you can run up to 4 copies, but it has the issue of Take Liberty and running like double Enigma, where the more copies you run, they have anti-synergy with each other because they will always discard each other if you draw multiple in your hand at once, which that means you don't have less draw in your deck that you're drawing into, which makes it harder to refill your hand after the first Special Delivery. So running multiple of them was a pretty big risk. There was some often moments where you would actually, if you were playing a deck with multiple Special Deliveries and playing against Britain, you would wait until they played Blackwatch to increase the cost of it to 5 and then just play it as a mobilization and just play 5 credits, and then it wouldn't discard your other Special Deliveries because they're now cost 5.
Yeah.
But it was run in a variety of decks, and most of the time it was just run as like a dump out your entire hand, draw 3. It was like some ramp decks would play this, where like you just like play War Machine as the only other card that costs less than 3, and then Special Delivery is just cheaper card draw. Although like if you're ramp, you probably have access to like Lend-Lease and mobilization. So like I guess you might. There's no reason not to just run a single copy of Special Delivery.
Not really. I mean, it is. We talk about this sometimes in cards, don't we? It has the potential to be decent filter.
Yeah. Now,
but you are right. You wouldn't. This is up there with a new card that's topical, Molotov Cocktail, that you don't want to run more than 1 of.
Well, there was at this point in time there was some aggressive decks that would run, I think, like 2 copies of this and just like sort of take that risk. There was one deck in particular at this point in time that was, I believe, running 4 copies of this in this tournament. Now, it was not an incredibly popular deck, but it is a deck that won one of the OCCs. And that's a deck that we will talk about shortly. But essentially, I will say there is a very small amount of discard synergy that you can run this in. Specifically, at this point in time, it's really just only supply chain. But if you have a supply chain in your hand, then you play Special Delivery, you discard the supply chain and get 2 back, and now you can draw like an extra card.
Yes, like I can see the thing. I'm just curious as not so much to that as a draw methodology. I can see that. I'm curious as to what the deck was doing. I'm excited to find out later.
Yes. But yeah, Special Delivery was changed to its current version of Discard 2, Draw 2 in October 2020. So everything else has been nerfed September 2020. There was also a very major balance patch the following month where they sort of cleaned up all of the stuff they didn't nerf in the previous one, and one of those cards was Special Delivery, because they were just realizing this is kind of seen play in like every single deck that has US main or US minor, and it is presumably has a very high win rate. So let's nerf this down to 2 cost, discard 2, and after that point, this card continued to see a lot of play, and eventually saw much more play at 2 than it ever saw at 3. But that is a topic for another video. Also, interestingly, is in September 2020, that is when they changed Betty to be its current version where it summons if discarded. So, you know, at this point, we still don't have any self-discard deck, like in its true form of Betty. But we are starting to get into that direction of Betty self-discard stuff. People were doing Special Delivery Betty in the months following this period of time, but it was not great. All right, well, we are now slightly over halfway, about 2/3 of the way through. And before we get into the next pair of cards, actually, I want to ask you, what do you think... At this point, we're sort of tiptoeing around and haven't said anything too explicitly, but what do you think are sort of the big baddie decks of this meta right now? And, like, what are the decks that people are building around? Not necessarily the best decks, as we've discussed, people might not have been the best deck builders at this point in time, but the popular decks that people thought were the best decks.
So... it's getting a little fuzzy, but I've got to think that there's some kind of Britain just kind of just different win con than Commonwealth decks out there that are trying to do a more value-based thing. I'm definitely of the opinion that there's some, I suppose, more presence kind of mid-range US deck that I have a feeling is probably relatively prevalent. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see it running some of the bigger US air units, maybe with some ramp, but that might be a separate US deck. I have a feeling there's maybe 2 or 3 different US decks out there at the minute that are kind of all looking at value in a different way. I'm feeling like Japan, maybe we're seeing some kind of attempts at control Japan. It didn't feel to me like anyone's really grasped onto like hyper aggro, and it's much more gonna be maybe people are still trying to make burn work. I'm really not sure about Germany, and I have a feeling the Soviets at the minute are having a miserable time.
There's a lot of points in KARDS history where I feel like Soviets are kind of either the best deck, or like the best nation, or the worst nation, and there's very little in between, and it's just kind of awesome.
I tend to agree. It feels like, I mean, it's particularly apropos of myself having done some of my record keeping on the day of we're recording and looking at my record with one particular Soviet main deck, and there are times when Soviets are amazing and times when Soviets just feel like no one cares about them.
Yeah. So now let's get into some British cards. We've looked at Rule Britannia. So we know Rule Britannia is seeing some play, but that's really the only British card that I think we've looked at so far. So let's take a look at 2 cards that came out in Theaters of War for Britain. The Honey and the number 1 Commando.
Then we go and check our instincts, because I feel fairly confident on this one, which is a dangerous place to be. Oh, that's not so... I'm just checking myself on a piece of history I don't remember that well. I'm pulling the trigger on my reserve at this, because this is like my shoot's not working, I'm pulling the reserve moment, because I honestly have to... Honey is so good in a world where Commonwealth and Draw exists. And...
So that's very funny. Honey is really good in a world where Draw exists is a very, very funny statement, because it is just incredibly accurate.
It is, isn't it? I mean, I don't know. I am aware that it sounds fairly ridiculous, but I don't know how else to summarize it. In a world where you draw cards, why would honey ever be bad? And I actually think in a value-generated world, and given that there are some nice little buff cards out there, not the least of which, by the way, would be being able to turn this thing into a 5/5 Death Touch card, that number 1 Commando is able to do some ludicrous trading. I honestly think these probably both saw a decent amount of play.
Alright, is that your guess?
It is. I'm sure I'm wrong, but I'm going for it.
You are absolutely correct. Both of these cards saw a ton of play. I don't have the exact numbers, but I'm probably willing to guess that both of them were essentially 3-ofs in every single deck that ran these cards. I don't think there was any... There was a couple British decks that... Actually, that's not true. There was probably a couple decks that ran Honey and not number 1 Commando, but both of them just saw so much play that I said that they're basically the same. They are both staples of the meta, absolutely. So that's gonna skip the how much play did these cards see, because you got that absolutely correct. These cards saw a ton of play out of the gate from Theaters of War. Now the question is, have either of these cards been changed?
This might be the hardest one for me, because I'm becoming more and more cognizant of the degree of imbalance. Intentional imbalance is something I've talked about in videos. If anyone likes game theory videos, go check out my channel. Intentional imbalance in design is a thing, and I'm beginning to learn more and more about, back then, the level of intentional imbalance that was palatable to the design team was very, very different to the level of palatable that exists with the design team I talk to nowadays. I can believe that both of these cards have been changed. It would not shock me at all. In fact, it would not shock me at all enough to that I will say I think it is very probable that I'm pretty certain at least one of them has, and I think it's very probable both of them have.
So, to be clear, you think both of these cards have been nerfed? These are nerfed versions of what was released?
It wouldn't shock me. Although, actually, it also wouldn't shock me. Actually, no, I'm going to go back on that one. It wouldn't shock me if Honey has been nerfed. It wouldn't actually shock me if number 1 Commando was slightly less good and still played ludicrously.
Alright.
Because
now, just throwing this out there. If you had to buff or nerf these cards respectively, how do you think that would have been done? As in, like, what do you think the original versions would have been for them to be changed to their current forms?
You just love doing this to me, don't you? I mean, that's kind of why we do this, but yeah, I can believe that Honey might have either had a point more defense, or in a world where everyone's lost their mind, been a point cheaper.
One credit, 2/3, Honey.
I'm saying in a...
I mean, they did release a 1 credit 0 operation 2/3 infantry in the previous expansion, so I'll give you that.
I'm learning. I am a processing machine here, and I'm beginning to try and adjust my head to the kind of Wild West we're dealing with. And I honestly could believe that that number 1 Commando might actually have come out as a 1/2. But that's probably the less certain one of the two. But that's the way I think if they've been changed, and I'm accurate about the way they've been changed, that's sort of the direction I'd expect. Now you can prove me completely wrong.
So, I'm very excited for this part, because I think a lot of people who have played cards back at this point in time, this is the moment that they are most excited for in this video. This is going
Why am I now very nervous?
This is going to be the big reveal, I think. Probably the moment that's going to shock the most people who didn't play back at this time. So, the number 1 Commando has never been changed. That is what it looked like on release.
Okay.
Now, The M3A3 honey, on the other hand, used to be this. And why don't you read that out for everybody?
Okay. The honey. I'm gonna bury the lead a little. The honey, 2-1, yay, 2-1. We've all come to know and love you. I was actually wrong. It's been buffed in its defense. It used to only have 2 defense. It still had the same card text. Lord knows there's a good reason it used to only have 2 defense. What lunatic gave the M3A3 honey smokescreen? If you can pop it, pop it. But in a world where the Commonwealth exists, who in their right mind gives honey smokescreen in a low removal meta?
Yep, this is a period. There's no pack 40s. There's no.
Yeah, there's all of you watching this, and I do get where you're coming from. You're thinking, oh, but this is cards and pip, pop, bam, things exploding. Back in the day, if you go and watch the videos, and you should, that's kind of not the thing. This is about, a lot of it is about unit trading and being able to remove a threat proactively with a body. Honey with smokescreen is terrifying.
Yup. And if you get any health buff on this unit, it becomes almost unkillable. Because there's a couple things that people might be playing that could deal 2 damage to a smokescreen unit, maybe. But if you play a weak and do it, it's over.
I was going to say, my thing is, you're correct about the 2 damage, but how many people are playing something that can pop 4 points of health through smokescreen?
Basically nobody. It survives carpet bombing, it survives strategic bombing.
Yeah.
That's people aren't really playing tactical strike. People aren't playing sudden strike at this point in time. At that point, it's I don't know, annihilation maybe if you're up against a discard deck. Yeah, no. Honey on release was absolutely bonkers, and there's a lot of cards. There's a lot of times where people make predictions about cards before they're released, and then they might be right or wrong about the cards once they've come out. You and I have both done this. You and I have both been very right and very wrong about various cards. And there's a lot of, people look back on things with hindsight. And a lot of people look back on Famed Retreat and they're like, oh, obviously, Famed Retreat was going to be insane. At the time, a lot of people thought Famed Retreat was oh, this is a weird experimental card, but it looks like it's probably going to suck. Honey, the second they announced it, everyone was okay, so we're just living in Britain meta for, until this gets nerfed, right? People didn't need to play with this card. People saw this card and were oh, so, Britain's just the best nation in the game by a mile, right?
Yes, because Britain's got if I can find the following cards, and by the way, I have some of the best draw in the game, put it on the board and find a way to give it any degree of extra survivability. Smokescreen's kind of good enough right now. All I've got to do is sit and wait until Commonwealth lands, and you're done.
Yeah. So, Honey was just such a silly, silly card. And it did not take that long to be changed. It took longer than you might expect. So, as we talked about, there was a balance patch in September 2020. So this was released in mid-July 2020. And then 1939 went on their summer vacation in August. So there was a balance patch September 2020 where they fixed the most broken stuff in the game. And then there was an immediate follow-up patch in October 2020 where they sort of cleaned up some of the stuff that was remaining, like Special Delivery and a few other cards. And then in November 2020 is when they changed Honey.
By which time everybody had grown to hate Britain to the degree to which it probably still is today, but for different reasons.
Yes.
Good grief, that must have been horrifying to live through.
Yes, Honey meta was just a truly awful experience because it was so hit or miss. Because if you missed Honey on turn 2, you basically just pass. Maybe you play a number 1 commando and it trades 1 for 1 with something in a few turns. But then you have to play your card draw and get deeper into your deck, and then, like, you find Honey on turn 10, and it's going to heal you, like, 2 credits and probably die to a Carbon Bombing on the following turn that you play it. If you play Honey on turn 2, you basically just started the game with 50 health. Like, it's going to sit there. It's going to get buffed by all of your AoE buffs that you play over the course of the game.
Yeah.
It's never going to get removed. It's going to be healing you as you play throughout your entire deck. It's such an incredible health gain. Like, people complain about Glamour Boys, and that's a valid card to complain about. But, like, Honey was just, like, 2-cost Glamour Boys, basically. Like, Honey was so ridiculous. And the great thing about Smokescreen units with Rule Britannia is if you play Honey, and then say, I don't know, you play, like, a Cup of Tea, or a We Could Do It, and it's like a 2-5, now it's a 2-7, and then you play, like, another We Could Do It, and it's a 2-10. It's a 2-10 Smokescreen that has healed you like 20 health, and if at any point the front line is empty and you have 10 plus credits, you play Rule Britannia, and now it's a 12-12 tank that can just operate for 1 and hit them in the face.
Which is interesting because it's probably quite useful in the presumably truly awful Commonwealth versus Commonwealth Honey mirror.
Yes.
Where someone's trying to get to a big enough tank to find a way to end this farce.
Yeah, so the Commonwealth mirror is actually, Commonwealth itself didn't see a lot of play during this period, ironically enough.
I mean, I suppose, why would it need to, given that what Honey's basically saying is, I can just take my time to get to any win condition I want?
The meta was basically like, if you're playing a Britain control deck with Honeys and unit buffs and Rule Britannia, and presumably a fair amount of healing that you're going to get through Honey and maybe other cards, you absolutely can put in Commonwealth. Some people did that, but it was a tech choice for just, like, specific matches, because if you're playing against any type of aggro, you either die on turn 4, or you played Honey and a couple of guards, and they didn't stand any chance whatsoever.
Yeah.
And then if you're against control, they're going to be running as much healing as they can possibly fit into their deck. So Commonwealth's not going to one-shot them, so why would you play a card that's 12 credits, don't win the game, pass on board, when you can instead just play cards that let you put more high health units on the board until you eventually play Rule Britannia to one-shot them. Like, it was all about getting boards that threatened lethal.
Let's just not forget that this is still a world in which fortification exists.
Yeah, so...
I seriously thought I was going, like, right to the edge of madness with suggesting it might have been 1 cost. That would be a substantially less insane card.
Yeah, I don't know what they were thinking when they released this. Like, I remember when I started cards, and I looked back in the old cards, Crusader used to have Smokescreen in, like, very early beta or, like, late alpha. And, like, that one I could get that one more than Honey. Like, it gives you access to a ton of card draw, but, like, you eventually deck yourself. You need to draw into a win condition.
Card draw fatigues you. This is anti-fatigue. This is, hey, look, we're in a control mirror and we get to fatigue and you've got 70 health. That's okay. I've got 160.
Yeah, also, this is funny you mentioned that. This was before they put a cap on health. There was no cap on health at this point in time. Honey is why they put a cap on health.
Who knew?
Because, yeah, essentially what you would do is you'd play Honey, Honey, Honey. By, like, turn 5, you have all 3 Honeys on the board, and then you draw 30 cards in your deck, and each Honey heals you 3, or you're healing 3 per card drawn, so you're healing 90. So you're going up to 110, and also in this time, I'm not going to really explain how, because it's going to be relevant in the future, and it wasn't super relevant at this point in time, but you could reasonably run out of cards, you could reasonably draw all 40 cards in your deck by about turn 8 in Britain. So if you hit your Honeys early, you can easily hit like 100 health off of Honeys, and then you're also playing stuff like Fortification or Naval Power or other healing. So you're easily getting up to like 160, 180 health in a game of cards at this point in time with certain builds of Britain control. And they thought that was a little too ridiculous, so they put the cap at 99.
Can't imagine why.
Yeah, there's... But now that we're through with some of the British cards that people were playing, let's get to... US cards, and this is going to highlight a deck. How popular this deck is, you will have to tell me. But how much did these two cards see play? Which of these cards saw more play than the other?
Oh, I feel called out now. Because this is a card that I've been on record as saying I think is one of the worst cards in the game. Okay.
Oh.
I am referring, by the way, to dear listener, to the B-17 Flying Fortress. It's such a ludicrous card. It's not quite as bad as the Ridiculous Elite. TBF. Okay. This is a big, heavy, very nasty air deck. This is nasty kind of... I've got bombers, but I'm controlling board state by just blowing stuff up. Also, the Avenger, which I'm currently reading, I find the random enemy with 5 or more defense is really interesting text to me. It's punt time, because I'm really not sure. But I'm going to punt on the fact that the Avenger saw more play.
All right. That is a pretty reasonable guess. You know, you can take out your opponent's honey once you get up to 8 credits, because their honey will certainly be above 2 health. But this is actually the second appearance of both of these cards saw copious amounts of play. Both of these cards were you ran 2 of both of these cards in every single deck of this variety. How much of this deck, or how much of these cards do you think saw play? And I'll tell you, they saw an equal amount of play, because every deck that ran these cards ran both of them.
I think that deck probably saw quite a lot of play.
Yes. Yeah, there was a lot of the big bombers flying around, which raises even more questions as to why we were playing Stalin. Because Stalin is 10 credits and died to TBF Avenger.
I didn't want to go there. But fair. Yes, it does. But yeah, I could believe that would see a lot of play.
So now we get to the question of, have either of these cards seen any changes?
For the sake of my own, reputation among the community, I'm hoping B-17 has been nerfed. I kind of want to think it's not entirely impossible that the Avenger was maybe a credit cheaper. But probably not. The Avenger's probably as was. I want to believe, though, that the Flying Fortress was somehow somewhat better.
All right, well, let's start with TBF Avenger. You are absolutely correct. TBF Avenger used to be 7 credits. And, yeah, this guy was really, really annoying, because why would you play any control deck with any big tanks when your opponent's just going to play a 7-credit Destroy It? And 4/4 Bomber is relatively easy to get rid of once it's on the board, but that's still, you have to spend credits and possibly a card to remove this, and it already accomplished what it wanted to do, which is destroy a very big unit on your side of the board for 7 credits. It's almost like an annihilation in that way, where it's 7 credits to destroy a thing, and then also they have to spend a card. In Annihilation's case, it's discarding it. This one's even better because they have to spend credits on spending a card to now get rid of TBF Avenger.
This is 7 credit removal with like a side order.
Yeah, TBF Avenger was nerfed in the October 2020 patch. So in September, they nerfed a bunch of the other cards that we looked at, the KFC, they nerfed Alliance. So it seems like they nerfed a bit more of the aggressive cards in 2020, or September, 2020, and then in October, they came in for the special delivery, the TBF Avenger. Now, B-17 Flying Fortress is an interesting one, where it has been nerfed, not once, but twice. However, both of these nerfs occurred much earlier on in the beta, prior to these tournaments. So this was the version that we were playing in these tournaments. So this is more of just an interesting history lesson. But it was this version. This is the in-between version.
Hey.
And it was nerfed to its current version in June 2019. So a little bit after I started playing the game. And it was nerfed from its previous version in May 2019.
I don't want to know.
Which... It wasn't as silly as you might think. It was just simply a very big guy.
Okay, that's not as ludicrous as it could have been. It's just cheaper than it needs to be. That's
Yeah.
fine.
At this time, it honestly, I just started playing the game, so I don't have like a great grasp of this, but I have to imagine that it wasn't because this card was incredibly powerful. I think it was just more like if you're a new player to the game and you're like, I'm gonna play down my 6/6 vanilla fighter and then my 5/6 vanilla tank, and then your opponent like slams this guy that like destroys it immediately, and then they have a 6/6 heavy armor bomber that you can't answer because your deck is like entirely vanilla cards and for the king. Um, and I don't think it was nerfed because it was too powerful. I think it was just nerfed because losing to big cards feels bad for new players because a lot of the base set was very vanilla at this time. A lot of the vanilla cards have been given simple card text as the game has developed.
Yeah.
But at this point in time, it was the version of Flying Fortress that we have in the game. It was just a simple another way of generate a threat, remove something big, your opponent has to answer it. And this is a period where people were starting to run less and less order-based removal as time went on. Empire of the Sun is starting to get phased out, and at this point, you're sort of entirely in on building a board. So you want all of your cards to be units or cards that buff your units on board. There is very little just like destroy an enemy unit type cards that are seeing any amount of play. So if you can play a unit that destroys something, and then it's also a big unit that your opponent has to be able to remove, and it's going to be harder to remove it because you just destroyed something, you can try to hit a critical mass if you're just destroying a big unit that they've spent, like, 4 or 5 cards buffing for a single card, and now they have to remove the threat. So
yeah, I'm starting to see that shape in my head. That makes sense to me.
There is still the issue of, like, Combat Engineers 35T can kill you on, like, turn 4, which, Avenger and Flying Fortress aren't helping with. But that's an aside. Now we see which of these two cards, we're sticking with US here, which of these two cards do you think saw play? Now we're moving away from the bombers and into the fighters.
You have got to be pulling a fast one here. So the reason that I think my lovely Canadian friend here is pulling a fast one here is that, given everything that we've just talked about, there is one of these cards that just seems to synergize so beautifully with the logic, which is the Corsair F4U1D, which just is, it's a fighter body that you can drop, and then when it dies, it blows something up, which seems to be a thing. And then you've got the Thunderbolt, which has this you destroy an enemy unit, draw a card on a fighter that's 2 operation cost, which, seriously, 5 cost 2 op, even with good stats. Thunderbolt is an objectively awful card in the current game. But I'm kind of concerned that I'm being sold a wrong-un here. And that somehow that card was a hell of a lot better than I think it was. Because it has got a good body. Yep, why not? Let's trust the fact that I smell something off here, and I think the Thunderbolt saw more play.
And I was trying to give you an easy one. You are, in fact, incorrect. Corsair saw more play than Thunderbolt. How much play did these cards see?
I mean, surely Corsair basically was just to slap this in the same deck that I'm putting all of the other big let's blow stuff up things in. Which is to say, a chunk. And Thunderbolt, probably none at all.
Yep, you are absolutely correct. There was 0 Thunderbolt in any of these tournaments. Corsair saw slightly less play than the Bombers because if you were using a US ally, it was the first card you would cut if you tried to reach 12 US cards. But if you played a US main with all of these cards, you're absolutely running 2 Corsair, 2 Flying Fortress, 2 TBF Avenger. And you are absolutely probably died to 35T on turn 3. Now,
I mean, I had my analysis was correct. I just didn't trust you. My bad.
When have I ever led you astray? Now, we've talked a lot about the main nations here. Now, France and Italy did exist in the game. And I have told you of one deck that was played. There was one person playing L640 Hyper Aggro. Now, I'm going to present you with 2 cards, one from Italy, one from France. Which of these cards saw play?
My instinct is too strong. Surely it's Spirit of Rome, and surely it's in some kind of truly, truly horrifying, honey-based Britain abomination like Italy control death. It must be, surely.
All right, well, this one is another softball question because that is absolutely correct. There was Spirit of Rome. Now, how much of these cards, or how much did these cards see play? Spirit of Rome was more played.
I have got to believe that Group Britannia, maybe someone tried it, but it was probably one oddball who maybe wanted to try to do something different, or the text turns out to be ludicrously different than it used to be. Spirit of Rome, I've got to believe there were a fair few people who were just thinking, this is a ridiculously good combo.
So, actually, I'll start with France. Nobody ended up bringing Group Britannia. Nobody brought France to any of these 3 tournaments. There was 0 representation for France. The cards they got from Theaters of War were absolutely useless. And the only French deck that saw played before this was Japan-France Resistance. That relied entirely on burning your opponent down with kamikazes, which doesn't really work if your opponent has 160 health. So France just stopped existing as a deck that was relevant for like probably the next like 6 months or so. People just stopped playing France. Now, Spirit of Rome is a fun one because this was actually only brought once. Only one person brought Spirit of Rome across these 3 tournaments. He did get to the finals.
I was going to say, please tell me. I probably didn't win, but please tell me he made the finals.
It did pop off when it popped off. It was known as the Roman Wealth deck, where you'd run Commonwealth, you'd run Spirit of Rome, and you'd just essentially try to heal up and then make a bigger guy or kill your opponent with Commonwealth or do both. And it was fine. The issue is, oftentimes this sort of happens when new cards come out, and new cards that are clearly broken, where somebody will try to just the most extreme version of the deck, where you just put in all of the most synergistic cards with the broken card into a deck, and it will be fine, and then as people play more, they will refine it down into, like, okay, you're still going to be running a lot of the good cards that were good before this broken card is. You don't have to lean 100% into it. You can just run the broken stuff with the other stuff. And people just sort of found out that going all in on the Italy with Spirit of Rome and whatnot, it just made your deck a lot less consistent. So, like, sometimes you would pop off and make, like, an 100 unit, and sometimes you would completely brick and just lose the game to control or aggro, take your pick, because your deck's just not doing what it needs to be doing. Because Britain was kind of reliant on ally cards at this point in time, and Italy had literally no good ally cards. Lion for a Day did not exist, Dachuba did not exist, Naval Engagement did not exist, Bologna Regiment was a completely different. There was just no good Italian cards outside of Spirit of Rome, and that's like Savoia, the guy that's the horse card that you can blitz them with Spirit of Rome with. So it was kind of a funny meme combo deck that didn't end up working out too well, but I wanted to throw that in there. Honorable mention to Hubble Bub. I did, in fact, lose to this deck in that OCC.
I love you, by the way. If you watch this at any point, I love you. You are the kind of person who thinks like I do and just wants to do the most insane thing just because you can.
Now,
not because it's the best thing, just because you can.
Now, I have a couple of clips from some of these tournaments that I'm going to show you, but before we get into that, since they will reveal some of the cards and decks that I've seen play, we have reached the end of the cards section. We are going to end with, I don't know if you remember this section from last time, but I'm going to give you the numbers of the play rates of the 504 units. Elites, and you have to associate them with which ones. And I will give you the numbers for the previous one. So just to give you some, again, there's not been any balance patches. It's just Theaters of War that has come out. So this was last time. There was 9 Nakshubs, 4 Pioneer, 2 Engineers, 1 Jasko, and 0 Signal Regiments in OCC 1. And because we are talking about 2 OCCs and an Open, the Open's a top 4, the OCCs are top 8, and one of them had 9, which not that important. But anyways, there was 21 lineups of 3 decks each, so that is a total of 63 decks. So the numbers are going to be much higher than last time, but in order of numbers, they are as follows: 18, 12, 11, 7, and 4.
Ah, the 0-4 game, how I love you.
And again, because these are not published lists, this is making some assumptions on what was presumably also in the list if we didn't see the exact list.
Yeah, sure.
And there is a couple, the reason that there's a couple decks that we just never saw what they played, and some people brought 3 decks, only played 1 on stream, and then lost, so there could also be more of these that there's 0 evidence of. So, you know, if you try to do math onto, like, adding them together or anything like that, keep that in mind.
I love that you think that I'm going that deep. Alright, so I think Signal's still going to be at the bottom at 4 in my head. Because I'm not envisaging... I am envisaging some people playing around with Burn, but not like that. So where do I go at? I kind of want to think that Pioneers is going to be... Is it going to be as big? What would you play more than that, given what I've seen? Yeah, okay, so I'm... Oh, this is very challenging. So I'm going to say I think top of this list is... Sorry, you've got to remind me, my memory is not great. Has Tube seen a nerf yet?
I do not believe so.
Okay, so I can believe that Shub is going to be either the 12 or the 11, but I think it's going to have fallen out of favour a bit. Because I personally think Pioneers is probably going to be the 18. I'm going to be wrong, but I think it is. Yeah, I think Signal is going to be the 4.
Was not nerfed for another year. September 2021.
Wow.
So sorry.
Fun time.
You will have to remind me of what you said. You said Signal 4.
Signal 5, Jasko... You say Signal 4 plays, Jasko 7 plays. It's got... Actually, no. Jasko 11 plays. I think Engineers probably saw less at 7 just because Soviets are going to be underrepresented. And then I think it's going to be 12 for the Shub and 18 for Pioneers because I think cheap draw and stuff synergizing with some of the Fun Britain stuff is probably going to be a thing. I have a feeling I'm going to be completely wrong, but that's where my head would put it.
Alright, so 18 Pioneer, 12 Nakshub, 11 Jasko, 7 Engineer, 4 Signal.
Yes, that was my guess. You can now prove me wrong.
Alright, well, let's start at the bottom. You are absolutely correct that the card at the bottom here is, in fact, Signal Regiment at 4 copies. There was a total of 7 Japan decks brought across all 3 of these, and of those 7, 4 were aggro, 2 were Feigned Retreat aggro, 2 were Burn aggro. The other 3 were Japan-German discard control, which people at the time thought was like a sort of like an anti-aggro pick. And so the Japan controls didn't have Signal Regiment, the 4 ones did have Signal Regiment, the 4 aggro ones had Signal Regiment. So Signal for J-Aggro has not really come into its own at this point just yet, because it would just get blown off the board by some of the other board-based tempo decks. And it would probably absolutely annihilate any type of control deck if you could build it properly. But the issue is if you're building a bad version of J-Aggro, you're going to get your teeth kicked in by Honey, and then you're going to be like, well, J-Aggro's bad, I'm not going to bother experimenting with this anymore. Now, you said 7 Engineers. That is also absolutely correct. There was, in fact, only 7 Engineers. There was only 7 Soviet decks brought, same as 7 Japan, 7 Soviet. Of those 7 Soviet decks, all 7 were control. There was 5 of them were Soviet USA ramp, and that was, you know, including some of those cards like the Avengers, the B-17s, the Corsairs. And I will say a very fun thing you could do with that deck, and this is something that this is sort of one of my first, like, big influences on the meta in like any way whatsoever is a lot of people brought Soviet USA control, and it was just, you got the big bombers as removal and threats, and you got some of the Soviet early game like sickles. But what I added to this deck was I put in Ural Factories and Red Banner, which were cards that were seen like some fringe play in other Soviet decks in general. But in combination with the US bombers, if you play Red Banner on TBF Avenger post-nerf, it obviously didn't really work back when it cost 7, but if you play Ural Factory on B17 after you play it, it turns into a guaranteed Pershing, and that's pretty good. When you play B17, you get the deployment effect, and then you turn it into a Pershing. You could do some wild stuff. Everybody was also... Some people tried Tractor Factories a little bit, but everyone was also just running Stalin in this deck, just as, like, an extra threat, I guess. Like, the meta was so heavy outside of, like, the specific tempo decks. It was like, you'd bring, like, the tempo deck, and then you would bring, like, 2 ramp decks, basically. And people were like, well, it's a ramp deck, you need to be able to beat other ramp decks. You're already running B-17s and TBF Avengers, and those are already targets for their removal, so just throw in more targets for the removal, and maybe they'll run out of removal. Now, the other 2 Soviet decks were Soviet Britain control and Soviet Japan control, which were, like, more fringe, slightly more anti-aggro, weren't really able to compete with all of the bombers going around at this time, because Soviets, at this point, had next to no ways of dealing with big bombers, and that's still almost true now. It was definitely a lot more true back then. Now, you said Jasko at 11... And this is absolutely correct. There were 11 US decks. All 11 ran Jasko because all 11 US decks... sorry, there was 10... sorry, that should be 10 Jasko. That's my bad. There was 11 US decks. 10 were ramp with Jasko. The 11th was the L640. So a slight typo in that should be 10 Jaskos. But yeah, the US was exclusively US Britain ramp. That was the only thing people were doing in US outside of that one L640 guy. And that was just because US had worse tempo cards than one of the other nations that we're going to be getting to. And it couldn't take advantage of the Alliance, which was one of the best cards that US had for offer, and that didn't work if you were a US main deck, because it's only non-US units that get the buff. And also, OCC1, if you remember back to it, one person brought a ramp deck, and they got second. But it sort of opened everyone's eyes to, like, nobody plays ramp on ladder, but, like, what if it's really good in tournament?
Tournaments, yeah.
And then the next OCC, a lot of people brought ramp, and then eventually, like, one of the people, the person who won that tournament had a ramp deck, and then in OCC3, a lot more people brought ramp, everybody brought ramp, and then it was just basically an arms race to making your ramp deck as heavy as possible to beat the other ramp players, while everybody continued to die to aggro because there were no bans. Now,
oh dear, we're getting to the bit I'm nervous about now, though, because the first 3 were relatively confident, and I'm glad I was right. I like being right. The next 2, I really wasn't sure if I read this right, so this is going to be interesting.
We've talked a lot about the power of Britain, and obviously the meta was a lot of very slow decks. You know, we had Soviet ramp, US main ramp. I'll tell you now, the most common British ally was US. It was a lot of US ramp. However, you have doubted Nakshub. Nakshub was brought by all 19 players, or 18 out of the 19 players playing Germany, and it was probably brought by, of the people that we don't know for certain, the only 2 people who didn't have Germany out of the 21 players with their 3-deck lineups were players in the Open, which the Open skewed entirely ramp. Only one person brought an aggressive deck in the Open, top 4, and that was Darkness, and he won. Because everyone else had Brit US ramp, US Brit ramp, Soviet US ramp, and they all lost.
Aha, because he just ran over them. Okay.
Yes, so the best deck in the game at this time was Germany, USA, Heinz, and it was... you threw the really good tank, like you could call it a tank deck, you call it a Heinz deck, call it a mid-range deck, whatever you want. It was a deck that was capable of winning on turn 4. It was capable of staying in the game and creating a couple different boards and winning on, like, turn 12. It was ludicrously high tempo. It could burn you out through guards. Joint Operation was, like, the only meta way of killing Honey. You just, like, play a unit on turn 1, they play Honey on turn 2. Your Joint Op does 2 damage because you have a unit on board. You Joint Op the Honey. Life goes on. Maybe you played Nakshub on turn 1, they play Honey on turn 2, you Joint Op the Honey. Well, I guess you wouldn't gain the credits because old Nakshub only off unit trading, but that aside, Germany-US, Heinz was absolutely bonkers. So that was 18 Nakshubs, 12 Pioneer Regiments in every single Britain deck. Britain was very, very powerful, and it sort of got more popular as the time went on. It was kind of held back by what some people were doing with US ramp, because people were still playing strategic planning US ramp, and strategic planning, which is double the stats of all cards on board, or your cards on board, it was a little bit better than Rule Britannia. If your board is a bunch of 5/5 bombers, you make it some 10/10 bombers, and suddenly your 12/12 Honey is not quite as impressive as the 10/10 bomber. So yeah, Britain struggled a little bit against some of the heavier ends of the deck, but it got better as people sort of realized that US ramp was not as good as people thought it was. It was a little bit of a rock, paper, scissors type situation where Britain-US was the most competitive deck that could sometimes beat Germany. Sometimes it was still disfavored. Germany had a favorable matchup into every single deck. But Britain was the one that's probably like 60-40 for Germany rather than like 90-10. And then US had a slightly favorable matchup into Britain-US, and then US-Britain just, like, could not beat Germany at all. So that...
Yeah, I can see that.
That was kind of the meta. There's some fringe things. People were trying their hand at... the one German deck that didn't see Nakshub in it was a German-Britain handlock discard deck, which didn't work out too well for that player, but people are starting to experiment with a little bit of different things. And the Britain decks, there was like one air deck, there was a Britain Soviet Commandos deck brought by Darkness. People were trying a couple different things out there, but the Britain-US deck is very interesting because this one was built in 2 different directions, and I think it's about 3 Commandos, 5 heavy ramp, where they ran a similar core of cards. And they all ran War Machine, they all ran Honey, they all ran Special Delivery to some extent, but there was a Commando version of Brit-US, which would run a bunch of Commandos, and the idea is you ramp up, you defend with Honey, you defend with East Surrey Regiment, which we haven't mentioned in this video, but was like one of the best cards of the meta. It was never changed. It was always just 3-credit 2/6 vanilla guard. But in a world where there's no suppress and no removal.
Yeah, I was going to say, at this time, those stats matter a lot more.
Yeah, so every Britain deck was 4 East Surreys, 3 Honeys, probably 3 Commandos. And that's how you're fighting out back against Germany. And essentially, the Commando version of the deck, it would ramp up, and then once you're on 12 credits, instead of playing like a B-17 or a TBF Avenger or something like that, what they would do is they would play, they'd have Pioneer, and at this point in time, Pioneer was a permanent decrease of 1 to all orders in your hand.
Yeah, I remember. That's why I thought it would have seen a lot to play.
So what you would do is you'd play like Honey, Commando, Pioneer, or maybe like you get a Crusader in there. It doesn't really matter if you have the Honey or not. And then you do like Cup of Tea, Special Delivery, Supply Chain, Special Delivery, Supply Chain, and you burn your opponent for like 45, and you end the turn with like 4 15 health units that your opponent has no way of removing, because To the Last Man is the only like true full board wipe in the game at this point in time. And then on the following turn, if they weren't dead from Commando pings, you'd play Rule Britannia, and then you have like 4 15-15s, and your opponent loses the game. So people were doing that with Commandos. It ended up being not as good once people got a bit more into the ramp version of the deck, because, well, your Commandos would just be simply blown up by big TBF Avengers, and they'd be able to just be slightly more consistent, slightly faster. Commando pinging, like, getting 30 Commando pings doesn't really matter if your opponent has, like, 75 health worth of units on board.
Yeah.
So it ended up being more of a Brit-US version. And the Germany deck, this German-US deck, invented by Ari Big Ben, same inventor of the German-Japan deck that was played previously, it wasn't really created by any buffs. Normally, you see new decks coming around, like the best decks that come around are either because a new expansion just dropped and the cards were introduced, or a balance patch just buffed something into playability. Sometimes it's like they nerfed something and then there was a deck that like was being held back. In this case, it was just purely this deck is probably might be the best deck Cards has ever seen in its time relative to the other cards in existence, and we just didn't discover it for like 8 months. We were too busy doing stuff with 34th guards and whatnot. This US deck was so insane. The September patch, like people discovered this deck at like sort of end of June, early July 2020. Theaters of War came out. It didn't, like, they ran like one special delivery, but that was basically it. Then 1939 went on vacation. In the game, next to your icon, it used to show what main nation you most played during that month on the leaderboard of the Cards OCC. So you could see the most played nation of the top 100. At this point in time in Cards, there was one player who didn't have Germany most played in the top 80.
On the previous comment, children, 8 months of not discovering the best deck in the game that may ever have existed is the result of getting distracted by Empire of the Sun. Empire of the Sun melts your brain.
Yeah. So this deck, absolutely insane. When 1939 came back from summer vacation, September patch, this deck ate 6 nerfs in September. It is the most nerfed deck in like one patch ever. We don't even get 6 nerfs overall anymore in a given balance patch that comes out once every 2 months. They were doing monthly balance patches once they came back from vacation, and then the first one they nerfed 6 cards in this deck.
No.
And that's not accounting for rarity. So I think if you account for rarity, they probably nerfed like 15 out of the 40 cards in the deck in a single patch.
Just someone sat there hitting the nope, 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 and no.
And then it was still playable after that. And then it proceeded to eat another couple nerfs in the patches that followed. It basically got like another nerf or two in the next like 3 patches after this point.
God. I swear, what I want to cut in right about now in your video is just a picture of Kelly's face and then the Grinch sound of hate, loathe entirely. Because that's pretty much what happened.
So yeah, let's quickly walk through some of the nerfs in the September 1st, 2020 balance patch. So Fast Heinz used to buff tanks anywhere on the board. They didn't have to be in the front line. It was just 1 credit, +2/+1 for all of your German tanks on board.
Because why not?
Joint Operation was nerfed to no longer being able to go face, because at this point, Joint Operation was still 2 credit, deal 4 damage to any target.
Okay, yep, it was still broken.
Panzer 3H, look at one of 3 cards in your deck to draw, it used to be a 2/5, it was nerfed to a 2/4. The KFC was a 1/2, it was nerfed to a 1/1. Alliance, which was a core part of this deck, because you ran US for Combat Engineers and Alliance, and those were basically the only 2 US cards you ran in the deck, was nerfed from 4 cost to 5 cost, and the Combat Engineers was nerfed from +1/+1 to +1 attack. And then honorable mentions for cards that were not nerfed, but people wanted to see nerfed at the time. Blitzkrieg, which wasn't even like, some decks didn't even run Blitzkrieg because you would just win with like the Alliance and just getting value trades and crazy credit generation off of Nakshub. People wanted Nakshub to be nerfed. It took another year for that to happen.
As honorable mention to Nakshub for being the most survivable broken card I have ever come across.
Greif was a big target that people wanted to see nerfed because you would just play Greif and then all of your units have 0 operation now because all of your units are tanks. Yeah, like I'm pretty confident that like the win rate of the deck, I'm sure, I haven't seen the stats, but I'm sure if you went in and looked at the stats of just like the win rate of this deck 75%, probably. Win rate of
I
this
was gonna
deck,
say-
if you have Nakshub and or Greif in your in like the top 5 cards of your deck, probably like 95%.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Yeah, if you're watching this and you feel the urge in your spare time, Karma, just go dig. It'd be interesting to see. But I would say that's probably about right. In fact, 75% for the base win rate might be conservative.
Yeah. Then there was a few other stuff that's like kind of going around in the October balance patch, which I'm sure we'll cover more in the next video. But at this point in time, Monty was still pre-nerf Monty. I mean, Monty's been nerfed like 3 times now, but it was like original pre-nerf Monty. So we factored that in. Monty was 1 credit, pin all enemy units, draw a card, unconditional, with Smokescreen Honey. So that got nerfed in October. Special Delivery got nerfed. Tractor Factories got buffed. SU-76, the card that we are now dealing with a lot, got buffed. And yeah, there was a series of changes that followed this. But what I now want to show you is 3 clips of just moments from this tournament to give you an idea. They are time stamped. So the first one, these are in chronological order. This was from OCC 2, and this is just showing off the Spirit of Rome in action.
Oh, there's the Spirit of Rome, and that's probably gonna be what? Good lord!
Look at that! Look at that HP there. Look at I think. Oh man. now he has 2 options. Is he going to go for the Commonwealth, or is he just gonna let the horsey take it there?
So yeah, that was
It's insane. Love it.
I just love that, that's beating one of the guy who liked Pershing in his deck, just Pershing being smacked down by a 56-56 cavalry.
It's big horse.
There is a screenshot from this time that I'm gonna see if I can find it. If I can, I'll put it into this video. But there was a screenshot from this time that was sent from the testing server into the main server by Scout, who was the resident like break the game player. And I'm sure he got permission to post the screenshot. But it was in testing Honey and Spirit of Rome prior to the changes, and it was a screenshot of him. No. It was. Oh, actually, I misspoke before. Honey and Spirit of Rome are not why they nerfed. This just yet. You could still get to 160 easily, and make like 160, but they didn't nerf the health total and the unit health total until Mare Nostrum came out, which is pretty shortly. Which Mare Nostrum was a 1 credit, give a unit +1/+1, and gain your HQ health equal to this unit attack. What you would do is you'd get up to 160, and then you would play Mare Nostrum. Like, you'd play Spirit of Rome, get like an 160. Then you'd play Mare Nostrum, and Mare Nostrum would stack. So you could, if you played 3 Mare Nostrum on a unit, and you attacked with an 160, you would get 480 health, and then you would play a second Spirit of Rome on it, and then you would play a third Spirit of Rome on it. And anyways, the screenshot that went around, and then this change was enabled, I think, before this card went out, or like a week after Mare Nostrum came out, something like that. It was a screenshot of Scout having, it was like 1.7 million health, and like on like 500,000 unit, something like that. Like, it got silly. The game broke, and they made the changes. So now health is capped at 99. Unit size is capped at 99. You can't get higher than that. Scout is also why they capped credits at 24, because you used to be able to get infinite credits. And that's a deck that we'll cover at one day. But anyways, oh god, that a shout out to Scout. Now let's take a look at. The German US deck was actually a very hard deck to find, like, a clip showing just how strong it is, because you kind of just won on turn 4. You would just, like, play whatever is in your hand, and then you won pretty quickly. It wasn't, like, a super flashy deck. Just all of the units in your deck were better than all of the cards in everyone else's deck. so you just played your cards and won. This is the sort of the flashiest clip I can get, and it's basically just like, look at what turn it is, look at what your opponent's doing, and look at what the German-US deck has on like turn 3, I think, turn 4.
Prevent him from either using that fast Heinz, or if it hits an alliance in his hand as well, pushing that back a couple of turns.
Probably most definitely going to use it now.
Yeah.
Pretty big board.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah, you would just every single card that was a German tank was insane. There was just no bad German tanks.
For those of you watching, because I do know that it is very difficult to evaluate this at times, because some of us see things differently. The previous clip is very impressive, and you've got the big numbers and the flash and the boom, and there's something glorious about that, and a million health and all of that stuff, but what you just saw, that's the sort of thing that breaks my brain. Because having been in card games for 3 decades, those are the moments when, from a design perspective, you realise there's a problem. Because it's turn 3. That's kind of it. That's the context. So if you really... It's kind of like, to understand how bad it is, you just need to replace all of the unit numbers with, like, Yu-Gi-Oh! Unit numbers, and you start to understand what a designer sees when they see that turn. Which is, dear God, what have I done?
Now, the last clip is going to be showing off just what a typical Britain v Britain mirror is. This is a more the commando build of the deck versus
This clip is
ramp
like
deck.
under 2.5 hours, right?
Oh yeah, no, it is just the end of the game.
Okay, just checking.
Also, a card that I want to bring up really quick that I realize I haven't really mentioned up until now, because it's never been changed, and it wasn't a huge part of the meta, but it did see some play just because of how silly it is. This is sort of one of the cards that it's like, people started to cut as they realized you don't have to commit fully to the health gain strategy, but Indian Brigade was seeing a lot of play in this time, because it made all of your honeys heal 2 when you drew a card.
Can't imagine why. Not at all.
And then also, if you're playing like the We Can Do, it's the Cup of Teas, then you're making the Indian Brigade into like a 1/8, and then you play Rule Britannia, and now it's a 10/10 Fury. But you know, you're running more combo pieces than you need to win the game at that point. You don't need double health off honey. You don't need to run Indian Brigade for like an extra Fury guy.
No, sometimes you just want it, because you can have it.
Yeah. So here is the last clip that we're going to be showing here.
Probably one of the most satisfying Rule Britannias, or one of the most terrifying Rule Britannias you've ever seen.
Where's he
He's
gonna go, dude?
contemplating.
I think he should go for it.
There's nothing
100%.
else. There's nothing else. Ooh, J-King sees it. He sees it.
And he can't put the Avenger on
Oh,
board
carpet bombing
Carpet
just
bomb.
one turn
Too
too late.
So yeah, you got to see both players' hands. Rule Britannia coming down on turn 9. Might have even been earlier if we both played War Machines this game.
Oh, God.
And like, looking at my hand, I have Rule Britannia. I have like 2 We Can Do It's. I have so many bombers and whatnot, but it doesn't matter because my opponent has a 9 attack Fury unit, a 7 attack Fury unit, a 9/9, and a 9/9 artillery.
It doesn't matter how god your hand is, it's all over. It's far too late by now.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
So this sort of shows how you know, how games went at this point in time. If you weren't playing Germany, if you're Germany, you just win the game. And if you're not Germany, you were doing this stuff where it's just like you building these huge boards, and oftentimes you would just like basically just continue to build massive boards in your support line and not really attack each other. And then, like, you know, like your opponent would play like a TBF Avenger and it kills like a 210 East Surrey regiment, and then you get like a 410 Corsair, and now they don't want to attack with their Avenger because it dies to your Corsair, and you can't attack with your Corsair into their Avenger because their Avenger is guarded by their 212 East Surrey regiment, and you both just sit there until one of you draws a Rule Britannia.
Yeah, and then wins the game.
Yeah, it was a very silly meta. We Could Do It again, another one of those cards where We Could Do It's probably like one of the most played cards at this point in time. It was just like we could do it in like every single deck because it was all about buffing the health of your units. There was no suppress, there was no removal, there was very little bounce. And it was just these massive, massive unit health totals, which is just so silly when you look at the way Cards is played today, where cards that buff units on board are kind of bad unless they're absolutely insane, like close air support, because like why would you play a card that's like only works if you're already ahead on board? Everything needs to be ideally a unit that destroys another unit when you play it, or generates credits when you play it, or draws 3 cards when you play it. Like Cards in 2025 is so much about units need to do so much when you play it. And here, we're just like jamming 4 East Surreys in every deck because it's a 2/6 that becomes a 2/9, then a 2/12, then a 2/14, and then a 16/16.
It's evolution of game. I mean, honestly, that's a whole different video that I'd love to do with you at some point. But the evolution of games is something like this, but it's so accurate. It really is. You get... like, so many people ask about different kind of buffs and why I'm not so big on them anymore. And it's the thing is that we live in a much more deployment effect and instant impact world in 2025, but this is a much different thing. This is like playing green back in Magic the Gathering when it first started. You just sat there long enough, and if your opponent didn't find a way to do something about it, suddenly your massive chusty dinosaur ate the board.
Yeah,
and that's how you won the game.
I'm just like looking at these decks, particularly the Rule Britannia type decks, where it's just like nowadays you couldn't even begin to build a deck like this because it's like you start to do this and then they White Death like the first week and do it, and then they drop like a Depths of Winter or like Winter Warfare ISU, or they just like they've developed into nukes by turn 7.
Well, I mean, God forbid, in the current meta, you look at them, they're running Germany, you realise on turn 4 that they're actually running Finland ally and somehow avoided Molotov death, and then they discard everything that you need to build your late board, and you just sat for the rest of the game going, would you just kill me already? Because I lost like 3 turns ago.
Yeah, and East Surrey Regiment being like one of the best people wanted East Surrey Regiment nerfed for like several months at this point in time, and that's why when Finish Boys was announced as a 3-cost 2/7 guard with additional upside, it was like, this is just like we have power crept East Surrey so hard.
Yeah.
But that's just the way games go sometimes, but. That's sort of the meta at this point. It was just slower and slower and slower. As these tournaments went on, it was more and more heavy ramp. And honestly, calling it ramp is almost a bit of a misnomer, because these decks were so heavy, they didn't actually run a lot of ramp cards because they were considered to be diluting the quality of your deck. So, in particular, the Britain decks, I think actually, they didn't run War Bonds, and I think most of them didn't actually run any ramp whatsoever. They were just hard-running Corsairs, B-17s, TBF Avengers, Carpet Bombings, and you would just get up to those credits naturally, because if you were playing War Machine, that would dilute the card quality of your deck. You need to run more card draw to refill your hand. You're less consistently just being able to play unit, we can do it, unit, we can do it, Rule Britannia.
Yeah, no, 100%. And honestly, if you look at the maths on decks like that, unless there is a strong enough skew in favor of credit advantage, which arguably there is now because units have more instantaneous impact, which is a whole thing you're starting me on a whole nother video I need to do. But anyway, the point being, yeah, it's a different world, it's a different meta, and in that meta, ramp, like the concept of what we would consider the power of ramp now, is just not present in the same way, because you don't mind having to wait for your big units, because mostly they're just big units.
Yeah. Then Corsair was a big part of this, because if you could just do like War Machine on turn 2, War Bonds on turn 4, and then like play down like a TBF Avenger on turn 5, and it kills like their East Surrey, and now there's a 4/4 bomber that Britain wouldn't really have great ways of answering that. Normally, and like that would be why you want to do ramp. That's sort of what people are doing now, where they ramp into stuff like production order. And like you'll still occasionally see the occasional like B-17 Flying Fortress. Corsair shut that down so hard because there was no suppress, there was no answer. So if you play Avenger and kill the Resurya, then they play Corsair, you're just immediately 2-for-1, and then you spent other cards getting the credits to play that early Avenger, and now you're getting 2-for-1, or at least 2-for-2, but you spent the War Machines, and like you would just lose. So that's why like like the US decks would run ramp because there just wasn't good US cards to fill a 40-card deck. But like if you played a Britain deck, it's like, well, I want 2 B-17s, I want 2 Avengers, I want 2 Corsairs, I want 3 We Can Do It, so that's 9 cards already. I want a specialty, that's 10. And it's like, I don't know, 2 War Machines.
I mean, if I really must, but arguably I can probably, and again, this is something we talk about in deck building, I'm sure you do endlessly as well, is that you don't necessarily need to use all 12 ally slots in every deck, because sometimes it's better to just run back to the core and go, but there's more core that's doing it better. And as you say, if I've spent those 2 War Machines plus the turns on them, which is the lost credits on the spend on them, plus the 2 physical cards, plus the card I put on board, plus anything that I use to get to it with draw, and then I get 2-foot off of it. I've effectively lost 6 cards and credits into the bargain. Why would I do that when we're in such a trade-heavy world, which is where you think very differently than we do now? Because we don't think in terms of straight... Well, actually, sometimes we do. Go watch my mid-range video. But we don't often think in quite the same terms of trades nowadays.
Yeah. And it's so funny seeing all of the... Like, this... Germany was such a central part of, like, the entire meta that in a period with no bans, OCC2, all 9 players brought Germany-US. All 9 players played Germany-US in Game 1, when you can bring any of your 3 decks. All 9 players started with a German-USA mirror, and then obviously one of the German-USs won. And then of the 9 players who lost in Game 1 of the German-US mirror, all 9 that lost brought it again in Game 2. And
yeah, I mean, of course they would. Why wouldn't they?
Yeah, so it's just so funny seeing the second and third deck of everyone's lineup just being like an arms race of building the heaviest control ever. And then the first deck is just like the most hyper-aggressive deck that like can't be beat. Well, it's not even hyper-aggressive. It's honestly very similar to like sort of a German France these days. Yeah, it's a very efficient.
Yeah, it's
deck.
just efficient. Yeah, it is German France is probably Ger France or US France currently would be the 2 decks that I think fit the similar pattern of just. It's not big, it's not flashy, it's just efficiency. Germany's just better at it still, which is a shame. Buff US went no, but Kelly, don't kill me. But no, in all seriousness, yeah, it is. It just becomes that thing whereby you're like, so my off deck has to be this massive heavy control monster because I kind of sort of know how one game in my series is going.
Yeah, and it's like Britain control stopped Jagro so hard, and Jagro was already bad into US, and it was terrible into Brit control, so you couldn't really bring Jagro, and then if you're not bringing Jagro, then you're gonna try to bring something that beats Brit control, which is heavier US ramp. And then like air just meant that you weren't bringing Brit control. So like there was
I was gonna say that's Bear's biggest problem at this point is that you're not currently allowed to bring 2 Brit main decks.
Historically speaking, that is the biggest issue with Britain is that you can't bring 3 British decks.
I mean, you can still make arguments quite recently, but yeah.
So yeah, that was this meta where it was just an arms race down heaviness, with the German deck being the only real tempo deck that saw any real play, and then September hit. Germany was nerfed into the dirt, which opened up a whole new realm of other aggressive tempo decks that can try to just race down these super greedy, super heavy board-centric decks. And that is what we will cover in episode 3 of looking at KARDS History, which will be the meta from the post-nerf Germany nerfs to the right up before the release of the Breakthrough expansion, which is going to be a lot of fun, and I look forward to getting there. But in the meantime, Bear, what do you think of this meta? What do you think of how we've come, looking at how these cards have changed, and the changes from OCC1 to these sort of sets of OCCs? Do you have any, insights or anything you could draw from this?
I'm going to have opinions, but I'm also... insight might be a fair word. I mean, one thing we are seeing, if we're looking at this, we make a lot of jokes about this, and I know lots of people have fun watching this, but this is also a really cool exercise, because it teaches us a lot about the game, its evolution, the people playing it, but also the people behind it. We're learning a lot about the people behind it. The story of 1939 as a studio shows really strongly in the way that this has evolved, because as I mentioned earlier, you really can see the smallness and the finding of its feet of a design studio in these changes. We've gone through some truly insane cards, like cards that were released that honestly, in the current testing, would never see the light of day. They just wouldn't. For all of the issues we have with things, and we always will, because games are games and it's a thing, this level of just crazy Wild Westness is something we're never going to see again, and we kind of need to look back and respect that, because it's kind of fun. Who thought it was a good idea to have a tournament where you're allowed to bring as many copies of different decks as you want? Who figured that it was a cool idea that, we would ever see earth-shatteringly long matches? Who thought Nakshu lasting for however long it did in its original fight? Whoever you are, we need a conversation, and you needed an intervention. But this is the evolution of it, but also... what's interesting to me, because I talk to lots of people about this, is you do see the shift to text heaviness. And that is something that is relevant to cognitive load, which is something I can talk about endlessly. The text heaviness of the older cards is actually much lighter, because, again, the game was in its infancy, and there was a need to try and find a balance. And I can't imagine how difficult breaking down the spreadsheet for unit of value was at the beginning of all of this, because the other thing that will always heighten how strong a card is how tiny the card pool was comparatively. Like, this is one of the most fascinating things you'll ever see, and I think this is a valuable thing for anybody to watch, plus hopefully we make it vaguely fun. But I would say the biggest takeaway you will get from this is to see and respect and learn about the challenges of both evolving as players, evolving as groups of people, but also evolving as designers and builders of a game. And there are things that maybe could be done better, and maybe there are things we could learn from. And I'm not going to get into a whole commentary about that, because that's not the point of this video. But yeah, and of course the last thing to take away is that if you thought you'd seen big units nowadays with buffs, hopefully at this point, you will have learned that your definition of large needs reconsidering when we look back retrospectively.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to see how absolutely broken some things are, and how hilariously terrible other things would be in the current year. Like that German US deck would be excellent. Like that would beat most of what's aggressive decks are doing now. Obviously, control decks would be able to respond to it better, but it would still be very, very powerful. All of those Brit US decks, US Brit ruled Britannia decks would be absolutely atrocious. Like terrible, terrible decks. But it's very particularly interesting to see how 1939 has improved with their ability to design control cards, because I feel like control cards in the base set and then Allegiance are very, very clunky. They're very, very overcosted. I think they were much more afraid to take risks with expensive cards, as opposed to aggressive cards, which were like, you'd be like, oh, okay, it's like a 1-mana 2/3 that discards cards from your deck. That's a downside, so like we'll give it a good upside and put 0 off, but it doesn't have Blitz, so like that kind of pays for itself, so like whatever. And then next thing you know, that's the #1 best aggressive card in the game by miles, and it would still be today. So yeah, it's just very fascinating to see that they would drastically underestimate the strength of aggressive cards and overestimate the strength of control cards in this period, but that is absolutely not going to be the case when we get into Breakthrough. So I'm very glad that you are joining me for this walk down memory lane for me, or in your case, exploring the depths of insanity looking at old cards balance patches from a design perspective, as well as old cards metas from a competitive perspective when we were cooking up. But again, thank you very much for doing this. The links to all of Bear's content, his Twitch, he streams much more regularly than I do, as well as his YouTube, are in the description of this video. You should go check him out if you don't already watch him. And thank you very much if you got to the end of what is probably going to be a 2.5-hour long video. It was a lot of fun to produce. I'm sure after this point, when you are watching this, it will have been a lot of time editing it. So, let us know that you like this type of content by commenting down below, liking the video, subscribing to myself and to Bear, do all of that fun YouTube stuff, and we will catch all of y'all in the next one.